Welcome to Work 24, a half-day virtual summit to help leaders harness the power of people and technology together. I'm Abby Lundberg, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be moderating the event along with my colleague, Editorial Director Elizabeth Heichler. This event wouldn't be possible without our sponsors. We'd like to thank Wharton Executive Education, Stanford Business Books, which is an imprint of Stanford University Press, and MIT Sloan Executive Education for supporting this event. Our theme this year is the human factor. We chose that name to recognize that while technology, and especially AI, is having a huge impact on work, organizations put their business models, employees, and customers at risk when they fail to focus on their people. Business leaders have to stretch themselves to understand how AI supports, enables, and disrupts people in their work, and how workers can help shape the use of AI in the most productive and effective way. Today, you'll hear from some of the top thinkers in this space. They'll share new research and advice, and you'll have the chance to ask them your own questions at the end of each talk. Our conversations about humans, AI, and work will continue even after this event, not just on our site, but in social media as well. So please follow us on your platform of choice. You'll find us on LinkedIn and Facebook at MIT Sloan Management Review. On Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Threads, follow MIT SMR. My colleague and our editorial director, Elizabeth Heichler, will introduce our first speaker. Welcome, Elizabeth. I'm so happy to be co-hosting with you again this year.
Thank you so much, Abby. I'm really excited about the program. We have just amazing speakers. And to kick that off, I'd like to introduce our lead-off speaker today, Jim Dietert. He is the John L. Colley Professor of Business Administration in the Leadership and Organizational Behavior area at the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business Administration. He's also a professor of public policy at UVA's Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. His book, Choosing Courage, The Everyday Guide to Being Brave at Work, aims to embolden workers to use their voices. His talk today will challenge managers to make more space for those voices and to listen to what they have to say. Jim, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Abby, and welcome to everybody, whether you find yourself in the morning as I do, or the afternoon or evening, or even perhaps late at night if you're in Asia. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today for a day of provocative ideas. I have a few specific things I want to share with you, but before I do that, I would like to actually encourage you to put yourself in a particular frame of mind. And it's a frame of mind that isn't about just believing what we say to you today, but really questioning and going perhaps even beyond the normal level of depth in how much you really dig into and question what it is we say. You know, I'm often reminded in situations like this of what William James, who is considered one of the founders of psychology in the US, said about 100 years ago. He said, most of us think we are learning when we are merely rearranging our prejudices. And, I have found that as I get older, what's very true for me, and I suspect true for many of us privileged to be together today, is that time is our most valuable resource. And I've realized that I don't have time left in my life to just rearrange my prejudices. And so I hope you feel similarly. And I ask you not to sort of believe hook, line, and sinker anything I say to you, but to be willing to really engage with my thoughts and others today. Okay, so let's dig in. I want to talk about the leadership I think we need today, and I want to sort of make a case for why that is. I want to start here with a quote that says, "Democracy in industry is not some idealistic conception, but a hard necessity. It is a system of values and beliefs governing behavior, including full and free communication, regardless of rank and power. And changes along these dimensions are being promoted widely in American industry." I ask you to guess for yourself what year you think this was written. How long ago? 5, 10, 20, maybe 30 years? Actually, this statement was written by Phil Slater and Warren Bennis in Harvard Business Review back in 1964, fully 60 years ago now. I was privileged to have Warren Bennis as one of my mentors in graduate school, and I was really inspired by this idea when I read this article around the year 2000. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 20 or so years, as I've worked and trying to help people speak truth about important ideas, problems, innovative ways, I have tried to help make this more true in organizations around the world. I also am sad to say that more recently I've come to realize that I think I've had somewhat limited success in actually doing this. And in particular, I and many of my colleagues have helped make things that were already somewhat safer in the first place more able to say and be heard. But we've struggled to actually get some of the most important things discussed or addressed in organizations. Let me show you a couple pieces of evidence that I look at to support my own feelings about this state. If you look at the Gallup employee engagement numbers, now I know many of you have seen this or heard about this. I think we almost all have at this point. What's been true for the last 20 plus years, where there's more consistent numbers and about 15 globally, is that only about a fifth globally and a third max in the U.S. say they are regularly engaged at work. And as you see, there's certainly no dominantly upward trend in those numbers. Similarly, private sector union membership back when Phil and Warren wrote that article about democracy being inevitable in organizations was at about a third of private sector workers in the U.S. At the end of last year, that number stood at 6% in the U.S. in the private sector. Now, I'm crystal clear about the challenges and problems of unions in many instances. All I would note is that unions have existed traditionally to be a form of democratic voice for the majority of workers in many organizations. And that's been rapidly declining. Now, it's also true that in the 60 years since Phil and Warren wrote that article about the inevitability of democracy in organizations, there have been tremendous technological advancement. Starting with IBM System 360, massive mainframe in 1964. We, of course, all know, the Apple Macintosh came on the scene in the mid-'80s, and the web in the late 90s started to take off. BlackBerry in 1999. I look at that device now, as I'm guessing most of you do, and think, gee, how silly and simplistic that device looks compared to what we hold in our hands just 20 years later. And then, of course, in around 2010, Skype, video conferencing technology became widely available. And certainly in the pandemic, we saw the importance of these technologies. And so unquestionably, there has been this harnessing of incredible intelligence and effort that occurs in organizations around the world to make the world a better place. And in so many ways since 1964, disease and misery and problems and poverty in some places has been greatly improved. I don't question any of that. I would note, though, that the spoils, if you will, the gains that have occurred from so much of the technology advancement has not been equally shared in many places, including in the U.S. If you look at the Gini coefficient graph I'm showing you here, the standard way of measuring the inequality of distribution of income, you see that the U.S. Is now significantly more unequal than it was back when Warren and Phil wrote that article about the inevitability of democracy. Similarly, the value of the federal minimum wage in the U.S. has gone down precipitously and remains low. It's roughly half of what it was in real dollar terms, adjusted dollar terms, back in 1970. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, look, you can't say that individual leaders and organizations are responsible for federal minimum wages or tax policies or anything else, and they're not. What I think we can say, though, is that they've tended to have a decided point of view about these things, and that numbers around employee engagement are more directly within the realm of leadership responsibility, and they haven't gotten much better either. So I'd like to spend our remaining time talking about one perspective on why I think some things have gotten so much better as a result of technology and the great work done in organizations, and others haven't yet. And what I want to essentially say is that there are a couple ways of thinking about power. And the standard one, the one all of us are aware of if we've worked anywhere, is that those with more power can explicitly or overtly punish unwanted behavior when it occurs, right? They can explicitly keep control. If you ask people why they don't speak up in organizations, and I spend a lot of time doing that, they'll talk about economic or career risk. They don't want to be blackballed. They don't want to be cast aside. They don't want to potentially be fired. They may also talk about social risks. They don't want to be ostracized. They don't want to lose their chance at being in sort of the circles of important friendships, relationships, or even strategic importance. And they don't want to have psychological risks. They don't want to feel stupid. They don't want to be embarrassed or be made to feel small for trying to be more innovative or speaking their truth. So that's sort of the explicit way that all of us know power can operate and get in the way of truth and innovation. I want to talk about a different kind of power. Back in 1962, around the time that Phil and Warren said democracy in organizations was inevitable, Sam Bacharach and Barretts wrote an article called Two Faces of Power. And they talked about a different, what they called sort of a second level view of power as the ability to confine the scope of decision-making to relatively safe issues. Now, I'm a little disappointed years later to realize that I read that article at about the same time I read the Slater and Bennis article, but I wasn't as inspired by this. It didn't lead me to try to do something over the next 20 years. And yet now, as I look back about what I have had more success getting people to speak up about and be heard, actually tends to conform to this view that Bacharach and Barrett said, especially in regard to what isn't being said or addressed yet. And in particular, what Bacharach and Barrett said is that the second level or view of power includes the ability of leaders to affect how the existing allocation of benefits and privileges can be suffocated before they are even voiced. In other words, many of the things that we might think need to be changed don't happen because they are never even up for discussion. They're never even on the table. So when I work in organizations, as I do a lot, these are the kinds of things that people say, oh, we commonly talk about these issues. We are able to say this with some degree of regularity. People can share ideas for making the organization more profitable. They can talk about the importance of using data to make decisions. They can talk about, at a high level, how important employee engagement is, or trust, or respect, or inclusion. They can talk about and encourage, even leaders will encourage, right? Taking more prudent risks, being more innovative. I hear those kinds of things a lot, and maybe you do too. What I don't hear reported as the kind of things that get raised very often are things like this. I think we've earned enough, or we are on a high trajectory for earnings. We should prioritize some of these other objectives we talk about. Or, I would like to make good data-driven decisions, but I can't do that without the access you're withholding from me. Or, I'd like to offer the idea that employee engagement is low because key people here aren't actually trusted and respected for what they're doing. Or perhaps an honest assessment that employees aren't motivated to take the risk that they perceive others above them will be the beneficiaries of. So if I put these two sets of statements that I just shared side by side and ask you to say, what's the difference? Right? I think we all sort of have an intuition that it's obvious that they're different. And the question is why, or what's a language we could use to describe that difference? And what I want to suggest is that the questions on the right tend to touch on what I call deep rules that all organizations have. They develop based on their history. I'm in higher education. We have our own deep rules. And when deep rules become rooted in an organization, often power doesn't need to suppress that kind of input because it is self-censored. People know that it's not safe, or they believe it's not worthwhile to go there. Let me give you a couple examples of what I think are commonly viewed as unsafe to discuss. I think it's unsafe in most organizations, no matter how profitable, to discuss whether making as much money as possible should always be the first priority of the organization. I think it's very difficult for people to talk about the distribution of pay and benefits in the organization, especially what certain people who get the most get. I think it's very difficult, right? We talk a lot about having honest performance conversations and giving feedback to each other. It's very hard to talk about that in the senior people in the organization. And I think we have a lot of deep rules that say what you cannot touch on are your beliefs that something is unfair or inconsistent, or that we're doing harm that we could be doing something about. So what happens when people do challenge deep rules? I'll give you just a couple examples. Raquel Kessinger, who's a recent graduate of the Sloan School PhD program, she studied in her dissertation employees trying to use their own organization's internal mechanisms for voice, for employee input. And her study included many of sort of the most well-known places, brand names like Google, Facebook, Netflix, Amazon, many that are considered progressive organizations in so many ways. Her most interesting finding was that as employees used these mechanisms more and in a louder way, some of these companies began to retract their actual openness to voice. They began to close some of these mechanisms for input. One of the companies, for example, removed language encouraging, quote, farming for dissent and speaking up when you see something wrong from its culture statement. Another company actually removed the words "be open" to its list of core principles. And then, of course, there's a union situation in the U.S. And again, I would be the first to admit that unions have often had a lot of problems and are not always themselves great vehicles for open and fair communication. However, what's interesting to note is that activity around unionization has gone up in the U.S. and support for unionization has gone up. We have heard too often, I would say, about corporate responses that verge on illegal retaliation. For example, the closing of stores under the guise of supposed low performance in places where unionization efforts are taking place. And then, of course, there's the work from home issue that's been hotly contested since it was forced upon us in the pandemic. In many places, people are willing to give up what is something critical to human beings, and that is a need to belong and be part of and be social, because they felt the environment they worked in was toxic or unfulfilling enough. And instead of really stepping back and saying, what is it about the way we operated that people would be willing to give up something so important, the sense of social belonging, to not be here? Instead of really digging into and questioning that, we see, I think, too many leaders responding with statements like, well, it's nice that we had the great resignation. Get ready for the great firing as macroeconomic conditions change. Now, I think that one of the reasons this trend might be getting worse, not better, is that we live in a world, certainly in the US, in a culture in which language has become weaponized, right? If we don't like what we're hearing, all we have to do is label the speaker in a certain way as not us, and then we don't have to listen to them. So, for example, if you question, no matter how supportive you actually are, and I am supportive, if you question, though, any of the fundamental aspects of the way the system of capitalism operates in the US, you are quickly labeled a socialist or a communist, and that ends the conversation. So, as we move forward today, here's what I deeply hope you will push yourself to think about and ask as you hear the other speakers, and then as we move forward in the days and weeks that follow. I think that in the AI era, sometimes we don't talk enough about EI, about the importance of ethical decision-making and ethical considerations and emotional intelligence in this era. And there are a lot of questions related to that. Like, why don't people actually want to be in the office? Why do we keep asking people to do boring, uninspiring work? Why don't we address the real reasons good people leave? Why is trust so low? Why is engagement so low? And then there are all conversations in the era we live in, not about sort of how can we use or for what can we use certain technologies, but should we use those technologies? And then who will benefit? How will the gains that these new technologies bring us be distributed? Similarly, I think we need to do more of, and again, this discussing the undiscussables is something the great Chris Ardress talked about. And I think his second domain is to say, are we going to talk about not people's espoused commitment to people issues, to the human issues, but what really seems to be happening, right? So we say that things like development for all is important, or reskilling, or improving boring, bad jobs is important. But do we spend the time and resources to really make that happen? We talk all the time about poor physical or emotional health. Are we willing to really put in the time and energy and hard work it would take to do this? We talk a lot about DI efforts. And one of the amazing things I think about diversity, equity, inclusion efforts is nobody is satisfied with what's happening. We have spent a lot of time doing short-term efforts, optics-based efforts, but we still struggle to have people feel truly included across the board. What are we going to do about that? Now, I need to stop, and I look forward to having a few minutes for Q&A with you and hearing what's on your mind. I'd like to end by saying that as you go through the day, including what you just heard from me, that you think not just about what you thought, but what you felt. You know, we have the core emotions we have, like joy and fear or anger, because they are evolutionarily evolved mechanisms for telling us what's most important to us. So it's okay if you're angry, inspired, or afraid of what I said. That's a guide for you to carry forth in your pursuit of better understanding rather than immediate labeling. And the last thing I'll say comes from one of my favorite quotes of all time. And that is that what seems to us in the here and now like unreasonable, maybe some of the things I've said seem unreasonable to you, later tend to become the things that we acknowledge led to progress. And in that vein, I'll stop with this quote from George Bernard Shaw, that reasonable people adapt themselves to the world. It's unreasonable people who attempt to adapt the world to themselves. And that's why, in the end, all progress depends on unreasonable people. So I hope you'll continue to push yourself to think unreasonable thoughts and take some unreasonable actions.
Thank you, Jim. That's fantastic. And we have got some good questions coming in. So just to the audience, please feel free to answer your questions in the Q&A. We've got about 10 minutes that we will get to as many questions as we can. So just to kick off, Jim, you've described a dynamic that anyone who has worked in the corporate world is familiar with. A lot of us have sat through very performative town hall type events, wondering why our leaders are so afraid of telling the truth or of hearing it from employees. Now and then we do hear of or meet or have the great fortune to work for exceptional leaders who aren't afraid to practice real transparency and actively seek frank employee input. Why do we grow so few leaders like this, and how can we cultivate more of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, we would need a very long time to really unpack that. Here's a few thoughts that sort of come to mind quickly. I think one of the challenges that makes it hard for people to hear and then not become defensive and then actually act on the truth that people of all types tell them is that they become too sheltered, and perhaps these leaders have been too sheltered. And for example, in my institution and many elite business schools, we have people who come from very privileged backgrounds. They are then socialized here in a very privileged background. We try to do some things around that, like send them on global trips. But when we send them on global trips, if we're honest, they meet people just like themselves and they stay in 5-star hotels. And so as they then progress into the sort of the hierarchy of work, I fear that what happens is the perspective, the worldview, the people they're around becomes ever narrower. And that makes it hard both for people to understand what people around them feel and to act in ways that are consistent. Many folks online may have, read about Robert Ism, the CEO of American Airlines, was in the news for sort of people not being so delighted with him trying to justify why he made $31 million last year, despite where American stands, at the middle or toward the bottom of airline rankings. And he cherry picked a few people and he talked about feeling okay about his compensation, good about his compensation. And yet, the CEO of Singapore Airlines, the world's #1 rated airline, made less than $5 million. He made 16% of what ISM made last year. And so I think that obviously what that suggests is that folks like that have a hard time seeing what people think about them. And they're perhaps not even surrounded by people who would say, hey, that's not going to go well. Especially since when Ism took over as CEO, he had said to employees, I expect you not to spend a dollar that doesn't need to be spent. So one is, I think, this bubble. The second thing I think is the models we teach when we do have folks, whether it's in education, whether it's in companies, development programs. We have, for example, in business schools, Paths to Power courses. And what do Paths to Power courses teach you? How to basically orient up in a successful way, how to impression manage, how to say things that your boss wants to hear in that way. We have many fewer courses on servant leadership, which is essentially downward focused. How do you get up every day to take care of your people and fight for them and understand them? And so in a lot of ways, all of us in the ecosystem that grow leaders are not really piercing the bubble of sort of like privilege and narrow view. And, I think that therefore what implications would be, we have to just devise, all of us have to find ways to devise ways to help people understand more about Main Street and how people there feel and less about Wall Street. And then we have to be willing to say, hey, if you consistently show that you don't care about that, or you don't have the humility to act based on that, then we're going to sort of slow your movement in our hierarchy. And that will take all of us, right? The media, everybody, to sort of change what we teach and what we celebrate.
Got it. Thank you. A few questions interested in your perspective on how this dynamic sort of works out in other countries, and whether the corporate cultures in other countries may make a difference. And maybe I'll point to a couple of things. One thing that was mentioned here by a questioner was the terms of employment, say in Europe versus here. If there's more security, do people speak up more? And then the other thing that I was curious about that sort of ties into this is formal mechanisms. Say, for example, in Germany, the Workers' Council, formal mechanisms that elevate voice. So what's your sense on how those things work in other places?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I would say is there are some differences and then some core similarities. So it's for sure true, right? In Europe, for example, where you have heavier union representation, you have these explicit mechanisms. There is more sort of formal voice on some of these issues. It's also true that in different countries around the world, I mentioned the Singapore Air. It's true in much of Europe, Scandinavia. The overall sort of broader national culture conditions and economic policy conditions are different. And so in those regards, I think you see some differences in the amount of involvement. Now, but what I would say in terms of where those differences end is if you think about these sort of risks I talked about, those largely speak to why you might not have as severe economic or career risks, right? Why you might not be fireable for questioning deep rules. They don't really change the fact that socially you can be ostracized, that you can be excluded, that you can be embarrassed. And they don't, and the reason those bases of fear are so important is the fear of being ostracized is perhaps what most affects whether people are willing to talk about deep rules. Because when you question something at a deeper level, what you do inevitably is make people around you uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And people everywhere are humans at the end. And so I think there's a combination of same and different. And I think, right, if you look at Gallup poll results and lots of other results, and certainly having collected a lot of data on speaking up, I don't find that in many countries, including the ones we would think of as sort of better on this dimension, they still have huge challenges with speaking up in organizations.
Okay, thanks. Now, of course, I sort of anticipated that this question might come up. Somebody is wondering, do you personally, can you think of or do you know of a good example of a leader who successfully surfaced and challenged deep-seated organizational rules to foster a more inclusive and a environment with greater voice culture and hopefully with greater results for the business as well?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to also see some extremely positive exemplars as I was studying courage. I talk about, I'll mention this one. I talk about him quite a bit in Choosing Courage. There's a man named Fred Keller. He's a founder of a manufacturing plant, Cascade Engineering, primarily. It's headquartered in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And he's proven over 40 years that you can still manufacture in the U.S. And there is no union in the Cascade plants. And the reason that's true is that Fred has spent his life down on the floor pursuing a mission where he said, I think that companies can do good and do well by truly partnering. And he's done some some frankly unthinkable things in the minds of many of his peers in Grand Rapids and nationally. He has one of the most celebrated welfare to career programs in the country. He was the first, to my knowledge, he was the first company in the U.S. to get the state to place a state social worker in the plants so that problems could be immediately addressed when people were late or had other problems before it escalated to firing. He has an incredible New Beginnings program for the re-entry of formerly incarcerated programs. And in every one of those programs, he repeatedly faced people saying, you're crazy, this won't work, this isn't the role of business. But what Fred Keller knew is, I know my people. And I know what they will go to the mat for because we care about them and because we're all in this together. And I have seen with my own eyes people with no managerial responsibility, high school level educations, former felons, come up to Fred Keller and speak truth to him in front of me, a guest. And so there are great examples of people doing work like this.
Great. So as our final question, we've got just less than a minute left. We all, as the saying goes, power never gives up without a struggle. Yeah. How do you motivate leaders to share power?
So I actually think there's sort of a two-pronged reality to this. I mean, some of how you motivate folks to share power is you have to get more skilled at indeed conveying the evidence that says, like, look, there's actually pretty good evidence that when you share power, things like engagement, trust, commitment, discretionary behavior goes up, and those actually are good for the bottom line. And so there is, in a sense, just self-interested basis for selling, sharing of more power. I also think we have to be realistic and say that sort of in the history of the world, there isn't that much evidence that people with the most power just woke up one day and said, okay, it's time to sort of give some of this away. And so I think about this as a situation where all of us are going to have to find the courage and the strength to say, in what ways is it important enough to me that I will also challenge power? I'll start to discuss some of these undiscussables.
Thank you. That is a fantastic note to end on. We're out of time. Really appreciate your time with us today, Jim. And this is just a really great, thought-provoking way to kick off this day. So,
thank you. And best wishes to everybody.
Okay, thank you. Our next speakers are Elizabeth Altman, who is an associate professor of management at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and David Kieran, who is the editorial director for research here at MIT Sloan Management Review. They'll be giving us some insight into how AI will influence work design, talent supply, and performance measurement. Elizabeth and David, welcome.
Liz, let's talk about one of our favorite subjects, workforce ecosystems, and the growing role of AI within them. For background, Liz and I, for the past 4 years or so, have been working on this idea of workforce ecosystems. And we've developed a framework for orchestrating and leading these systems, which comprise people within the organization and partners and other external contributors to get work done. Now, with the advent of generative AI and the growing adoption of AI more generally, workforce ecosystems have become more complex, more strategic, and also more fraught. Building on Professor Dietert's presentation, we hope you leave this presentation thinking more expansively about your workforce, about AI's role in conducting work and what it means to be a socially responsible organization. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A if we keep to schedule, and let's dive in. So let's start with a familiar but polarizing question. I hope this is a familiar question, and it's certainly polarizing, because on one side, kind of the doomers, they say, AI is going to eliminate more jobs than it creates. It's going to make decent jobs even more scarce, and jobs themselves that remain are going to be a weaker source of personal growth for workers. On the other side, the optimist, AI is going to create more jobs than it eliminates. It's going to free up workers to be more creative, productive, and strategic. And they're going to be more decent jobs, not less. Now, we're not here to answer that question, how will AI impact jobs specifically? But we just want to point out that there's a common theme among both sides of this question, the answer to it. And that is that jobs are important and the jobs for employees are important. And specifically the jobs employees have, will have, or might not have going forward. But to understand the wide-ranging effects of AI on work and workers, we need to think beyond jobs and employees. We need a better question. Liz, do we have one?
Yes, Dave. As a matter of fact, we do. Again, it's great to be here, and it's really fun to be talking about our research from the past few years that we were working on together, and specifically about workforce ecosystems. So we've done a bunch of research over the last 3 years, and have really, the more we talk to people, realize that between 30 and 50% of workforces now are made up of external workers. So when you have an organization that is 30 to 50% external workers, then the question also becomes, it's a better question and it's an additional question, how will AI impact these workforce ecosystems? And I think that's what we're going to talk about here today. In our research, we found that 93% of our respondents say that, of managers, say that external workers are very important. And 74% also say that you need to be able to manage these external workforces. And what's also interesting is we find that our respondents have said that people aren't really preparing to do so. So we feel like people need to prepare to manage workforce ecosystems, but really also to understand AI in this context. And we keep talking about workforce ecosystems, but let's just spend a moment and talk about what exactly do we mean by when we say workforce ecosystems, because we find that people have different views and different understandings of what we're talking about. So while this is a little bit technical and we won't go into all the details, I think the key point here, and people can read it, but that the second sentence, the structure encompasses actors from within the organization and beyond. So we are always talking about not only employees, but also other contributors. And it's important, and I think it's always helpful for me to think about both individual and collective goals. So if you're not thinking about who is doing this work and what their goals are, in addition to the organization's goals, you can get yourself a little bit lost. So we have really tried to put together this definition, and going back to the first sentence just for a moment, we have it. When we talk about interdependencies and complementarities, I think the most important part of that is just to think about the relationships of those who are participating. And David, do you want to take it to our next slide?
Sure. So, we've been so pumped and excited about this. We went and wrote a book about it with some colleagues from Deloitte. And, one of the driving forces behind, and part of the reason for writing the book was, thought, like, if the composition and boundaries of your workforce have changed, and that's what it means when 30 to 50% of your workforce just aren't actual employees, that the composition of the workforce has changed and they cross boundaries. Like what happens from a leadership point of view? What happens from an organizational point? What we found was it's a big deal. Organizations that are grappling with these larger extended workforces, parts of their workforces, it's changing how the executives lead, it's changing how they're organizing their businesses, and it's changing how they think about social responsibility, what it means for their organization to be socially responsible. So the first part of the book is organized around like the many different flavors of workforce ecosystems and their ties to strategy. And the second section, which is the thicker section of the book, lays out a framework for how to orchestrate and lead these structures that Liz was just describing. And the third part is about kind of the ethical concerns that emerge when workforce ecosystems become a more dominant part of how your organization thinks about it, but also part of the business landscape that you're operating in. And what people have told us they found quite useful is that about the book is that there are questions at the end of each chapter to help leaders and managers and thinkers like consider like what's important to consider as they develop their own workforce ecosystems that are tailored to their own needs.
Absolutely. And I think that third section, which David, you contributed heavily to, also brings in corporate social responsibility and kind of what is the organization's responsibility when you're operating in a workforce ecosystem, which is really important. So let's go back, though, to one of the chapters before part 3, which is about the technology that are relevant to this conversation. And I think it's particularly relevant for today's conversation and for today's entire conference. And we found, as we were talking about this with amongst ourselves and with our interviewees, that we continue to just talk about technology. You know, technology is important. People like to talk about technology, but we needed to clarify what did we mean by technology. And so we developed this essentially typology where we talk about 5 different types of work-related technology. And I'm going to very quickly walk through them because, again, I think it's super helpful for me to kind of categorize these. And then, of course, we will jump to the 5th one, which I think people are most interested in hearing about today, which is this notion of technology as a workforce participant, and particularly AI for today's conversation. But just cycling back for a moment. So work tech is technology that helps you get your work done, right? So it's about augmentation, collaboration, and what are you actually trying to do? So any tools that people use to do work, that's work tech. Workplace tech is technologies that you use to manage a workforce. And that's, workforce tech, interesting. These are different than, the order is different than they are in the book because I'm looking at the book table. Workplace tech that we have here as number 2 is Zoom or one of these platforms or technologies that allow you to work differently from different places, right? And that, of course, became more and more important through the pandemic, and we're seeing it continue to have importance as people are figuring out what it means to operate in a world where you can operate in a hybrid mode. Workforce tech is tech systems that you use to manage a workforce. And why this is really relevant for workforce ecosystems is it's not only internal workforces, but it's also external workforces as well. And systems like talent marketplaces, opportunity marketplaces, et cetera. Verification tech is also credentialization tech. It's the ability to have people be able to, in real time, prove who they are, what they can do, and what they've done before. And that's, again, important. And AI can help in this process as well. And then the 5th, which one is the one that I think has the most potential for us going forward in today's conversation, particularly, but in general in our research, is technology as a workforce participant. And that basically says we thought about technology as an enabler, as a facilitator, but more and more we're thinking about technology as a participant. And it started with robots and automation and hardware and software systems. But these days, And then we were thinking a lot about bots and chat bots and things like this. But this notion of a true collaborator, someone you can work with or something that you can work with that we're going to talk more about today, I think is a really important element of this conversation.
Yeah. So when we started to think about the role of AI in various work processes, we took a step back from our work tech typology, and which was really a way of thinking about organizing the bewildering array of technologies that are operational in all these work activities. It became clear to us that the different categories of work should really anchor our discussion of AI and workforce ecosystems. And one of the motivating forces, one of the motivators for us with this conceptualization was we wanted to think beyond like how we wanted to think about how AI capabilities influence work beyond workforce automation, cost reduction, and productivity gains. Because our research was showing that there are all kinds of ways that AI could be enabling work that isn't covered by straight up automation. And we arrived at these four work-related categories: designing work, conducting work, supplying workers, and measuring work and workers. And the conducting work is really where a lot of the examples that you hear about at conferences and that are discussed in the media, there are hundreds and if not thousands of examples about how AI can help with the conduct of work. But there are these other dimensions of work that are in play that they can be subsumed by conducting work, but there are actually some useful distinctions by keeping them separate. So we wrote a paper for the Brookings Institute on this, which emphasized the policy implications of AI in all these different work categories. And one of the things we discovered that kind of really hit home for me is that AI in each of these categories is double-edged. You can use AI to help managers or workers like assess their own performance and grow from it, or you can use AI to micro measure performance in ways that create a much not a very desirable work environment. Or you can design work to create more flexibility and to be more adaptive to changing circumstances, with more flexible work arrangements that can bring in workers from externally and blend them with people internally. But you can also do that in a way that increases the likelihood of a two-tiered worker status within your organization, where the external contributors are treated one way, not as good a way as the way the employees are treated. And, setting aside all the different tiers that exist with in and among the employees. So one last example, you can use AI to help increase diversity among your employees, but maybe you don't use AI to increase the diversity of in your external contributors. Like, how do you understand diversity when you have an ability to increase diversity with employees? Thank you, Liz. But not the other way. So this is AI's. So going back to this, we're going to give some examples in each of these categories.
Exactly. So I think also, given our time constraints, we're going to be very quick about these four examples. But I think to kind of put a finer point on it, we'll walk through each of the categories and give an example. So let me just start. And in our book, we have a bunch of different examples. And in our work, we've used a few, but Novartis is one of my favorites. So I had this great interview with Marcus Graf, and he talked about so Novartis has something like, when the time we interviewed them, there are 110,000 employees and something like 50,000 contingent or external workers, right? And so in order to figure out for any given project, what should be the mix of who is working on it, what tools, what resources, etc. Marcus was talking about integrating their systems, right? Because they have internal systems and external systems, and being able to have one tool where you can essentially press a button, and a manager can do it, press a button and say, okay, these are the types of resources I need. Here are the best ways to get those resources. And also then going forward, what are the best ways to do development of those resources and to continue to kind of work with those resources. So I mean, Novartis is using these tools and an AI system to help them figure out how they're going to do the work. And I think that's an excellent example of this designing work. David?
Yeah, one of my favorite, like I said, there's like thousands of examples around like using AI to conduct work. One of my favorites is KLM, where they were trying to get better at on-time departures, which like you can be late for a variety of reasons that are completely out of control of the airline. But sometimes there are factors that are within your control. One of them is passengers who, they check in, but they don't show up for the flight, and then you have to take their baggage off of the airplane, and the baggage handlers have to like dig through hands and knees, going through the cargo hold to extract the bags. And it's a very time-consuming process. The flight loses its position on the tarmac, and delays has implications for the flight crew because they have to manage the people on. So what they did was they used AI to predict which passengers were most likely to be late, and they gave those passengers baggage a VIP like red badge to and so they were loaded last, and they were easier to extract for the baggage handlers.
Great. So in terms of, and I'm cognizant of our time here, so I think we need to kind of crank through our last two. So supplying workers, Uber is a perfect example where you use AI to match drivers and riders. So the AI systems are being used to figure out which workers should perform each task. The broader conversation about supplying workers with AI also is around labor platforms, Randstad, SourceRight, TopTal, others, and how they use AI to make the appropriate matches between people who need work done and workers. David, you want to bring us home with the last one?
Yeah. So IBM spent a decade, like a while ago, creating an AI model that could predict which employees were most likely to leave their organization. And it did, and then it went one step further, where it predicted which of the workers were going to leave that the company wanted to stay. And it measured and weighted more than 1,000 parameters and helped the company identify these people. And the tool became so accurate that the CHRO who was leading this effort told us, manager came up there and said, like, how did you know this person was getting ready to leave? It was very poignant but very powerful illustration of the accuracy of the tool. And now many companies have attrition or retention algorithms, and it's changed how many HR departments evaluate attrition risks, including the companies that supply contractors to companies like IBM. So that's now there's a whole story to be told on measurement and workers. We're going to get into that a little bit more in this next slide here. So if we take a step back from all of these examples, we see AI-driven automation and augmentation improving performance. But it would be short-sighted for leaders to think only about using AI to automate and augment performance. First, automating and augmenting performance on existing metrics can be problematic when the metrics themselves become outdated. You can use AI to enhance key performance metrics and keep them refreshed and up to date. And you can also use AI to revisit assumptions about what drives performance. So AI can help redefine performance, not just improve it. And that's a big deal. And it's a good question to ask is, how are you balancing your efforts to maximize performance on existing metrics versus efforts to improve your metrics to ensure your key performance is optimal? Deploying AI to help with one, but not the other, that may not get you all that you want. So that brings us to the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting stuff. I wish we could have. It's very rich, and I know that we just sort of skimmed the surface in a way. So hopefully, we've got a number of questions here, and maybe we can go into a little more detail. But one little question, and just as a courtesy to an audience member, others might have missed this too. Can you clarify the difference between work tech and workplace tech, if there was one, or if you're just...
Sure. So work tech is tech that you use to do work. So very simply, like Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or some sort of a tool that you're using to do work. Of course, there's much more specialized, but it's during your day, what you're using to actually accomplish your tasks. Workplace tech is like this platform we're using, or Zoom or Teams collaboration software that's really about the place in a both virtual and physical way, and helping the organization and the participants collaborate, work together, kind of where they are and meet where they are. David, is that anything
I'd
you
love
want
to add to that.
Oh, good. That
Okay.
never happened.
Thanks. That's helpful. We have a great deal of interest was piqued by your description of the Novartis tool. Unsurprisingly, that does sound very cool. One questioner wonders, how do they prioritize things like costs, time, growth and development opportunities, team diversity in scoping out resources required for work?
Sure. So my first answer is I don't know. So because I don't know the kind of behind the scenes, but I just want to mention one thing that I think is interesting about this. I think their vision for the tool is super cool. I think they've taken, at least when we spoke to them, they had taken a number of steps toward the beginning of integrating it. One way that I think about that helps me think about is really back when I was a VP of business development, we used to think about whether for any given project we were doing, should we do a strategic alliance? Should we potentially do a corporate equity investment? Should we acquire someone? Should we do it entirely organically? And we had this kind of stream of or spectrum of thinking about relationships. And I think this is another way of thinking about relationships. So when Novartis is thinking about for any given project that they're trying to do, what relationships do they need to accomplish that? And including internal, right? Which internal resources do they need? Which external? And for those external, are some of them going to be individual contributors? Do they need to work with some professional services firms? Might they consider an alliance, et cetera? And I think what it does is allows managers to think much more holistically about what resources they need to accomplish their goals. And of course, then what comes with that is these trade-offs on time and cost and location and risk, frankly, time to market, et cetera. So that's how I think about. I don't know how they're doing it, but I'm certain from conversations with them, they're all of those trade-offs are coming into play.
Yeah, their vision is to include all of those things in the tool.
Right.
Okay. In your presentation, you only sort of briefly talked mentioned surveillance technology and sort of concerns about that. In your research, did you see differences in employers' willingness to use technology depending on their relationship with what kind of a workforce person, whether it was contingent workers or hourly workers, or are there certain classes of workers that are more likely to be subject to surveillance technologies?
Yeah, it's a very rich field of inquiry. One of the things that came up was there's the kind of monitoring that's done with employees in the office can vary substantially. It can be very different from the kind of monitoring that goes on with employees that are remote. It's like you can be remote, but you're going to be subject to like much more in like monitoring and close watching than those who come into the office. And then there's this, one of the executives we spoke with said, look, at one point, the difference between a contractor who's coming in and somebody who's working for your company who's remote all the time, there's a very fine line. I mean, like, what materially is the difference between them? And there isn't much other than, in terms of how the work gets done and their contributions to the organizational culture and such. So there are instances we saw where contractors get highly, but we don't have a sense. I don't think, Liz, we don't have a sense about, like, on average it goes like this, but we've certainly seen instances where contractors were subject to more intrusive monitoring than employees.
I think that's fair. That's totally fair.
Okay. And okay, very good question. We've just got about 1:45 left, so I will try to get this out quickly. In the IBM example of using AI to improve employee retention, could you talk about ethical, responsible AI in the context of data collection? What kind of data was collected on the employees? Is there informed consent?
Yeah, I love that. Actually, I was at a dinner the other night with some people at a consulting firm, and they said, and we were talking about this kind of example, although they didn't know I was about to use this example. But they said they're not allowed to build attrition or retention algorithms for companies because it would reveal, because a lot of personal data would be revealed to them. So that's at least one category of business that isn't working on this type of thing. But within the organization, to be fair to the organizations, this is HR doing this. They already have information about the employees. So it's not like they're collecting anything that they wouldn't otherwise have collected. It's just something that you do as part of your it's part of what you reveal as an employee. It's not anything extra. I don't know if I'm really answering the question, but in terms of privacy, there isn't a violation of privacy when you're using data that's already that the company already has legitimately.
All right. I guess the question, and we can close because we're running over, but yeah, that still raises interesting questions about consent, nonetheless, in terms of the employer-employee relationship, and how we think about information that we reveal in the course of doing our jobs is going to be used and analyzed. So, good questions all. Thank you.
And
please.
And I would just extend that and say, you said employee-employer, and I guess I would just say it as worker-employer, because in this case, they may not be employees, but
Right.
all the same questions stand. And that's, to me, one of the most interesting parts of the conversation.
Absolutely. Everyone experienced the same level of dignity.
Right.
Got it. Thank you both so much, Liz and David. Really great stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for being with us. And I am now delighted to be able to introduce Ethan Malik. Ethan is the Associate Professor of Management at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. And my colleague, Kaushik Withnath, will be on with him. Kaushik is our features editor here at MIT Sloan Management Review. And the two of them will discuss one of today's burning topics for managers, which is how could we best use generative AI in the workplace? Ethan, Kaushik, welcome.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session of Work 24, Reinventing the Organization with Generative AI. This is going to be a fireside chat and Q&A with Ethan Mollick, who's Associate Professor at the Wharton School of Management and also author of the AI newsletter, One Useful Thing, and also author of the recently published book, Co-Intelligence, which is a New York Times bestseller. So congrats, Ethan, and welcome to Work 24.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ethan, I'd like to start the discussion by asking you, you recently wrote an article for MIT Sloan Management Review that's about reinventing the organization, in which you say that generative AI is one of these technologies that is going to fundamentally reshape or restructure the way that organizations work. How and why do you see that happening?
So if you look at the development of organizations, they're tied to technological change. The org chart was invented in 1844 for the New York and Erie Railroad as a way of organizing work and when we had to synchronize work across vast distances using the telegraph. Hasn't changed much since, by the way. In the 1920s, we implemented a whole bunch of different work techniques around the idea that we would have time clocks and assembly lines. In the early 2000s, agile development. But all of those methods, depending on there being were built around the idea there's only one kind of intellect in the room, which is human intellect. So we need to have human monitoring, human coaching, human performance. And now we have access to a different form of intelligence. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same as a human intelligence, but it has pretty strong implications.
And do you think that is going to affect particular functions in the organization?
Well, I think it's going to affect every function. I mean, we've already reorganized how our internal little startup works inside of Wharton. Agile development doesn't make sense anymore. People can do more work than they did before. We can have marketing done automatically by the AI, like all sorts of changes. So like the question is which functions are not affected? And the question is who learns fastest about how to change things? So, we have a general purpose technology. It does a lot of work at the 8th percentile of human performance, whether that's legal work or medical work. It makes mistakes too. How do we build a system of control around this that takes advantage of what it does well, but avoids the disasters that might result if it does it badly?
Interesting. One thing that I noticed in preparation for this session is that, the article that you wrote for us is headlined Reinventing the Organization for Generative AI, and this session is called Reinventing the Organization with Generative AI. And of course, we as editors are the ones who come up with these headlines, so it's entirely on us. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit to this question of do we as the humans in the organization need to proactively make changes to the organization in order to be better prepared for the implementation of this technology? Or do you think that this is just a wave that's going to affect all organizations regardless of how we adapt to it?
I think both things are true. I think we have a huge amount of agency right now, right? We have a model that we know has performance impacts. Every study we have shows real, impacts in the lab and in real world settings. And we're hearing more and more from the field about huge large scale impacts. Like when we did our study at Boston Consulting Group and with my colleagues at MIT and Harvard and the University of Warwick, we found that just giving people access to GPT-4 increases performance by 40% on real consulting tasks, like without any training or anything else. Those are big numbers. So, but you can't just have something that throws off big numbers. It has to be integrated into organizations and systems. So I think I think organizations need to be thinking about this. AI will both do things to them. It already is. If they don't realize it, their employees are already using AI everywhere. They're just not telling them. But it also lets organizations do things for themselves. But if you wait for someone to tell you what that thing is, you're going to be behind. So part of it's about experimenting and learning as you go.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me a little bit more about the kind of transformation that you've witnessed and have been participating in at Wharton? What are the kinds of changes that...
Yeah, and we're doing experiments now, right? It's a small organization, but like, for example, we used to, if we wanted to get we developed a new screen for our software, right? There'd be a whole process where we'd get a team meeting together and we'd send it out to testers. And then we'd have a long meeting about our own internal feelings about it. And then somebody would compile those results and we work from there. Now we don't do any of that. who needs human testers anymore? It turns out that the AI works really well as a first pass tester. You show it a picture of a screen, say, act like a high school student. How would you react to this? And you get pretty good answers. Are they as good as a human? We don't actually know, but there's some early evidence that they do a pretty impressive job. And then why do we have a meeting to discuss our views when we just talk to the AI and each of us gives our potential views about what we want to see happen? And then the AI compiles a priority list. And then instead of having a meeting where we just talk, we can literally tell the AI, make the background green. What happens if this is larger? And actually get changes to the system. Radical changes from a week of work with all these slow delays to a day of work.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that you mentioned earlier is the problem of generative AI not getting everything right all the time. We're aware of how it can hallucinate or make up facts from time to time, or just be inaccurate or leave out certain facts. We've seen this in our own use of generative AI tools in our organization. So how do you advise teams and organizations to get around the fact that this technology is not always 100% reliable?
Well, I mean, it isn't, right? And that's important. There's a couple of things to think about. One of those is the analogy that we use to talk about AI is often flawed. We talk about software as our analogy, when in fact, AI is not a person, but it works like a person, right? It's trained on human writing. It works like, people who are really great at prompt crafting often have no coding experience whatsoever. So part of this is that you need to be thinking about this as like a person that you're interacting with and making changes. And then, by the way, you expect people to have big flaws and make mistakes. You'll learn what those flaws are. And it's really important to learn that because AI has this jagged frontier. It's really good at some things and really bad at other things you wouldn't expect. If you ask it to do a 25-word sentence, it'll mess up because it doesn't see words the way we do. It sees tokens. But if you ask it to write a sonnet, it'll do a great sonnet. How do we work with a device that can do great sonnets but can't do 25 words? We're going to have to learn that. And I think part of the question we have to think about is what reliability means. In large parts of our jobs, we expect there to be human error. The question is AI error worse or better than human error? We obviously shouldn't be using it to run a nuclear arsenal at this point, and I would not be taking it as your only medical advice. But given that studies keep showing that the AI's advice for GPT-4 is often better than most doctors, I would probably be asking a second opinion from the AI. How do we work all of those things together is kind of an open question.
So I think the way in which we perceive or set expectations for what we get from a generative AI application is crucial to our use of it, because one thing that I've read about is that we as humans tend to place too much faith in the output that we get from these LLMs. So what level of skepticism, or if skepticism is not the right word, how much should we double check the output that we get from one of these tools?
So part of the problem is you should double check, but you're not going to. This is part of why I really think we need a different standard of approach, because we can say everything we want about people double checking. The research that we have and others like Fabrizio Acqua's other work shows that as soon as an AI is good enough, everyone falls asleep at the wheel. They stop paying attention to what the AI can do and can't do, and they don't check the results. And I've seen this myself. My initial version of using AI in my classes, I had my students be able to use, I said, use AI all you want, great, and you're responsible for your errors. And that was fine when ChatGPT 3.5, the free version, was the only model out there because the AI messed up a lot. When GPT-4 came out, it messes up less than my students. I can't spot. There's still errors, but they're really subtle. So I think you're not going to check results. What we have to do is think about systems and processes, just like we build systems and processes around human, issues and errors and results. We're going to have to do the same thing with AI. There'll be areas where you'll want AI checking AI results, or you want to be really careful or ban AI entirely. But huge amounts of white collar work, including a lot of the stuff that you and I do, is subject to error and mistake. And the question is it, the standard I tend to use is BAH, best available human. Is the AI or better or worse than the best human you have access to at that moment? And that should help you decide whether you want to use it or not.
Right. I think one issue that I think about a lot is with a human, the human is ultimately accountable for the errors that they make or the output that they put out into the world. And, if you find that someone in your organization is messing up too often, then they're either no longer part of the team or they get assigned to a different role. With AI, it's just one technology. And so where does that factor of accountability come in for the results?
I mean, you're asking the organizational questions, right? Organizations are designed to facilitate accountability, to ensure that we have that decision rights are well distributed, to understand about systems of control and hierarchy and coordination. And the whole idea is that AI has to fit into this somehow. So I think we have to decide what those issues are. And we may have a very different view of how accountability works, right? We may decide a use is fine with some risk associated with it. I mean, do we hold accountability for people when they're doing ideation? Not really, right? Like you're generating ideas, there's a process afterwards. Do we hold accountability for, we hold accountability for errors? Do we hold accountability for upsides at every location? Like we have to be thinking about these things, I think, in a pretty complicated way.
Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you, LLMs have emerged as this general purpose tool. They're good at a lot of different things. How should organizations be thinking about whether they should just use one of these models off the shelf, just incorporate ChatGPT into their organizations, or whether they need to develop some kind of custom-built tool that fits their particular industry or organization?
It's a complex question. So one thing to note just as a baseline about LLMs is that the frontier LLM models, of which there are 3 right now, the largest, most expensive models, so that's Gemini 1.5 from Google, GPT-4 from OpenAI, which is available through Microsoft products as well, and Claude 3 Opus, are much better than any other model. And basically, there's a scaling law in AI that the larger your training set is, the more expensive the compute is, the better the model, the smarter it is. And one of my favorite illustrations of this is Bloomberg spent $10 million plus training Bloomberg GPT on all their cool specialized stock trade data. They built a specialized LLM, and it did a pretty good job doing things like sentiment analysis on stocks. But it turns out of the box, GPT-4 just is better at all these things, even though it wasn't trained for finance, because bigger, smarter models are generally better. So there is a difference between the kind of thing that people are building as IT solutions, where you're trying to lower latency and decrease costs, and the kind of white-collar analytical use where you want intelligence brought in that I've been talking about here. In those cases, a slower, more expensive model is often better because it's just smarter at everything. So I recommend people start by experimenting by just having people use these systems themselves. When I was at MIT, I worked with the great Eric von Hippel, who's still a professor there. And Eric famously talked about user innovation, that people actually invent things for themselves. This is the ultimate user innovation. The initial use has to be a use for people to understand what it's good or bad at, what it's used for. That can go in parallel with or a precursor to customized solutions. But I think people are overestimating and building customized solutions first before figuring out what their strategic advantage is from AI.
And speaking of user innovations, you've been working with a lot of companies that are they're finding new ways to both develop this technology and implement it in new ways. What are you seeing as some of the most interesting new applications?
So I think that there are, it's less about applications than I think trends that are going to be widely implemented everywhere. And I think I could show you a couple if that helps.
Yes.
So let me show you 2 things I think everybody should be thinking about. One of those is agents. Okay, so I'm going to show you Devin. I don't take money from any AI lab, including Devin, and it's still very flawed in a lot of ways. But I think there's some interesting things to note about it. So this is that it basically works kind of like a person. Like I give it instructions. Like here it was like business. I just started this a couple seconds ago. I want to understand the key. Here's a Excel spreadsheet. I want to understand the key assumption of the spreadsheet and do the work. And you'll notice what the AI does is it comes up with a plan and it just starts executing the plan. It has, it's building code, it's opening documents, it's compiling reports. I don't have to do anything. It'll ping me if I need help. In the meantime, it's just going to go and spontaneously do the work. What makes this so interesting, and you can see all kinds of fun examples of this. Here's like I asked it to look up the educational standards for teaching 11th grade history teachers about history students about the Red Scare. And you can see it went through a whole plan. And then in the end, what did it do? It gave me, let me see if I can actually find it here. It gave me a nice full working website. Let me see if I can locate it. Where are you? I have to find where I put it. But I get a full working website. I'll find a different one, fun website for you. And it just runs, right? It builds all the stuff I need for me. Is it amazing yet? No. But what it does that's really interesting is that it actually works like a human. So in terms of integrating within an organization, and here's one that I built to analyze 10K documents. I just have to give it instruction, and it goes ahead over time and builds the code it needs. It searches the web. It does all the work. This fits in with how human organizations work because it's kind of like working with a contractor. You assign a task and it does it. So I think that's one big thing to watch out for. OpenAI is explicitly building better agent tools. I expect we're going to see a lot of this, and it's going to change how we integrate with organizations rather than just working with chatbots. The second is massive context windows. So this is Google's Gemini 1.5, and it has a million token context window, which means it can hold a million tokens of almost words of information at a time, which means I can do things like throw in everything I've ever written and ask it to talk about the themes, give me quotes from my work. It does a great job on that. But I also could do things like throw in an entire video. Let's see if we can get one in here successfully. And let's see here. And I could say, tell me, this is a 30-minute video, right? Tell me interesting things that happen that might appeal to a kid. Give me timestamps. And the AI can process the entire video and give me information. We'll see if it does it in the time we have available to us. But it also could do things like I've had it record me using a screen before, and it could tell me what I was working on at each point and give me suggestions like a mega clippy looking over my shoulder for better or for worse. So I think the idea of having multimodal systems that could do voice and video and things like that, and all of that kind of live and work with tremendous amounts of information is something that I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of in the near future.
Interesting. How important is it to get the prompt right? Like how much margin of error is there, or is that not even really the right way to think about it?
So prompting is super weird, and I might shut this down. Oh, here we go. It's by the way, it's giving us our results here, and you'll notice it actually knows what happened at each moment of the video. It's talking about why kids might like it or not. I mean, that's pretty miraculous that we can kind of throw something in and have something reason over this entire distance here with all the timestamps and everything else. So there's basically two kinds of prompting to worry about. The first is like just interact with the AI, and people make this way too hard. Just talk to the AI, tell it who it is, and treat it like a person. You're 90% of the way there. Then there's this idea of building more structured prompts for other people to use. There's a little bit of skill involved in that, but it's also hard to kind of optimize too much. Like, for example, the single best way to get Llama, which is which is one of the major AI systems from Llama 2 in this case, from Meta to solve a 50-problem math question. It started literally with this quote: "Command, we need your help to plot a course through this turbulence and locate the source of the anomaly. Use all available data. Start your answer with captain's log. Start date 2024. We've solved the anomaly." But if you want to solve a 200-problem math test, you start with, "You've been hired by important higher-ups to solve this math problem. The life of the president's advisor hangs in the balance." How do you work with a system where you increase the accuracy sometimes by pretending that you're in Star Trek, and the rest of the time you pretend that you're advising the president? Like, trying to get all of this right, like, it works better when you offer it tips under some circumstances. The AI performs slightly less well in December, and we think it might be because of winter break. Like, it's a very strange set of tools to use. So I don't worry too much about optimal prompt crafting, and I think prompting is going to get easier as the AI takes over prompting, and most people just need to use it and not stress so much.
Okay. So do you think that prompt engineering is going to emerge as a specific discipline, or do you think it's just a skill that everyone is going to pick up over time?
I think the AI is going to do your prompting for you, so you don't have to worry about too much.
Got it. Well, we have another minute before we open things up for Q&A. So if you have a question to everyone attending here, please drop it in Q&A, and we will. I'll pose it to Ethan. In the meantime, I just want to ask, what do you think is the next stage that we're going to see? What's going to happen in the next few months, in the next year?
So everyone is waiting to see how. So basically, GPT-4 is still probably the best model in the world, and it's only a slight upgrade from the version of it that was released a year and a half ago. So everyone's waiting to see what the next version of GPT, whatever, is going to be, and from OpenAI, and that's going to make a big difference because we're going to see if we're still on this exponential curve of improvement or not. Even if we aren't, the die is already cast. AI with its current capabilities, just with making additions and changes and think about it, it's going to be 10 years of continual growth and integration with our organizations where the change is just beginning. But if the models keep getting better faster at the rate that they have been, then we're in for a very interesting time because the AI will start to outperform humans across a variety of tasks in the not too distant future.
That's fascinating. All right, I will open things up to Q&A. So let me just take a quick look at the questions that we've got in from attendees here. So one interesting question is, how do you handle the degradation of AI models when LLMs start using their own outputs as future inputs? Do you see that as an emerging problem?
So this is a concept called model collapse. And there was a famous paper about it that when the AI starts training on its own data, it will eventually kind of choke and decrease in quality. And there's two answers to that. The first is, or three. The first is that we still have data left, right? The second is that a new paper just came out yesterday suggesting the model collapse won't happen. That as long as you have some original human data, AI-generated data doesn't actually hurt. And so it's unlikely to see model collapse actually happen. And the third is that already most of the models are starting to train with synthetic data. So you're using AI-generated data to train AI. So I don't think that this is actually going to be the barrier people think it is. It may still be, but it doesn't look like it's going to be that big a concern.
Okay. And we have a couple of questions here that are based on, you mentioned that agile development isn't really relevant anymore, or may soon no longer be relevant. What do you mean by that? And are you advocating some kind of hybrid approach or ditching agile altogether?
I am suggesting that agile was built around particular sets of constraints, right? And so it's built around coordinating work around fast sprints, but it also is built around, a set of management techniques and practices and what a human could do to in a period of time, and what kinds of what you could do, to as a observer of that or as a manager of it. And I think a lot of those constraints have just changed. So that doesn't mean agile has to be completely destroyed, right? But it does mean that if you're not acknowledging that, what does it mean when someone can code 10 times faster? What does it mean when an AI can provide what happens if we automate test harnessing and, QA? What happens if you don't need this daily stand-ups because the AI can keep a status report going on, right? You have to rethink these things. We don't have answers. Organizations get to decide this. But I think we have to recognize that the constraints on things like coding have changed dramatically. And the organizations that figure out how to take advantage of that will do much better than the organizations that don't.
We've also got a question here about skill building and foundational skills. One concern that I've seen expressed from some people in senior management is that if people have access to these AI tools to take care of a lot of the sort of work that's done by lower level employees, then those employees don't develop the necessary skills that they would need to have an understanding of, have the kind of understanding they would need to be effective senior managers. So in that sort of skill development across the course of a career, how do you see AI fitting into that picture?
Yeah, so I think that the crises within the school systems and education we could solve. AI ultimately will make us better teachers, and we'll have to change how we do some things. I am very worried about what happens once they graduate, right? Like I got my MBA before my PhD at MIT Sloan, and much like with my students, I teach people how to be good generalists. And then they go and work for a company, and they learn from an apprenticeship system about how to actually work for that company. So they write deal memos over and over again if they're in finance, or they might be, doing editorial content if they're in publishing. And it's kind of tedious and it's kind of low level work. And you might get yelled at a lot if you have a bad boss, but that's how you learn about how your field works. And the thing that worries me most is the apprenticeship system breaks first, right? I would argue that in most cases, AI is already better than most of your interns. If you haven't used a GPT-4 model for 10 hours and haven't played with it enough, you may not know that, but I would be surprised if in most fields, it doesn't outperform most interns. And the question is, are you still going to train people in the same way when the deal is broken, right? The deal is, I help train you, you do work, but if I get the work done another way, am I still training people? I think we're going to have to rethink about how formal training operates in organizations.
Mm-hmm. And are you seeing any new approaches to training itself, or is it too soon to say?
Yes. My classes are now 100% AI required. So I literally I have AI tutors in their classes and AI mentors. They interact with AI simulations. It's built deeply into how I teach. So I'm sure we'll see more of that spread as well.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions here around concerns around confidentiality, data privacy, and ethics. What are the main issues that you see emerging around those themes, and how do we tackle them?
So I'm going to give you something controversial, which is privacy is way overrated as a concern. There are other ethical concerns I'm concerned about, but privacy, I've been trying to figure this out because everyone's using cloud apps in their organizations all the time, right? You are regularly sending documents to the cloud. The cloud has access to confidential files constantly in most organizations, right? And people don't get worried about that. You don't think Dropbox is going to steal your files or that Google is stealing your email. Like, it just won't occur to you. So why do people, AI is a software process, right? It's not something magical. But I think that people think of AI like an entity. Like the AI is kind of watching everything they do. So if you show GPT-4 something somewhere, it appears everywhere. But the truth is, if you are paying for enterprise grade AI, they promise not to train on your data. That's the only way information, and aside from a horrible mistake, that's the only way that information leaks into the training data set of the AI is if the companies decide to take your data and train on it, which they absolutely do for the free models, but will not for any of the paid enterprise levels. And so to me, it's a little weird that people are so worried about privacy. Don't use the free chatbot, right? Makes complete sense. If you're in a regulated industry, there's different rules. But for most use cases, I wonder if privacy is a little bit people are overly worried compared to the number of solutions available to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you get HIPAA compliant versions of it. I mean, there's lots of options out there. So I think responsible experimentation is important, and I think the privacy concern is less of an issue. Now, ethics, there are lots of ethical concerns about how the AI is trained and the biases inside these systems, and whether or not you can copyright it that's trained on copyrighted material. And those are other issues that have to be unpacked. But I think privacy sometimes gets an overly large lion's share of the concern. I think some of these other concerns are more real.
So what are some of those other concerns?
So, I would be very worried about using AI to make personnel decisions, for example. We know there's a paper that just came out that shows that it is biased against disabled people. However, if you give it DEI training manuals, it actually removes the bias. So it's kind of interesting. There's a version of this. We know that if you ask an AI to GPT-4 to write a recommendation letter and it's writing it for a woman, it'll mention her warmth. If you mention it more, and if you give it, ask it to write a letter of recommendation for a man, it'll mention his competence more. That is a very human bias the AI replicates. So it replicates their own biases. I mean, I think there are things to be worried about and concerned about, but I think that, again, treating like a person, understanding what's good or bad at, I give you a private decision-making authority by staying the human in the loop. That's what's important here.
That leads me nicely into a question that we have here about policymaking in organizations. Are you seeing organizations craft, organization-wide policies around using AI and how it should and shouldn't be used in decision-making? And what are some sensible guidelines that organizations should adopt?
So what I'm seeing from a lot of organizations is very vague guidelines that absolutely discourage anyone from using AI, because it tends to be things like use it for good measures, but if you use it for bad measures and you don't get approval, you'll be in trouble. So what happens is everyone still uses AI. They just don't tell you about it, right? So I spoke to a woman who wrote a policy banning ChatGPT use at a bank, and she used ChatGPT to write the policy on her phone. So I think part of the issue you have to recognize is there's a difference between pro forma kinds of stuff, which is like we're covering ourselves legally, and actually trying to create real policies that guide the organization. And I think that, ethical use is really important, but you have to recognize that people are using this in a shadow IT way. So I hope that people are realistic about what they embrace for policies, right? Do you trust your employees to not do wrong things? Do you want to specify what never to use with AI, but otherwise you can use it? Do you want people to disclose in a responsible way that they're using AI? What incentives do they have in your organization to do that? Because if the incentives are, I might get fired if I use this wrong, or even worse, if I use it right, I might get fired because you'll realize my job, it can be automated. People are going to share things with you. So I think that people think in terms of policy making, but not in terms of culture or change. And in a lot of ways, that's much more important.
So what are some, more, positive ways to craft a policy, or should there just not be a policy at all?
Oh, there should be policies, but I think you want to model successful use rather than shutting things down. Show examples of how people are doing things. I've seen organizations where people are giving out $10,000 prizes at the end of every week to whoever figures out the best way to automate part of their job with AI. Like, I think it can't be you will be punished if you use it wrong, and there's no reward if you use it right. So modeling behavior, I often recommend that C-level executives spend their 10 hours to learn how to use AI, and then model that behavior. You show it off in meetings, and then you could have negative things. Don't do this, but do this. But the real danger is only showing don't do this. People are just going to secretly do it, or they're going to not do it for you. They'll do it for themselves.
Got it. Well, we're all out of time, Ethan, and I'm sorry to everyone whose questions we couldn't get to, but thank you so much for being here with us.
Our next speaker leads Capgemini and Van's workforce and organization practice. In this role and throughout her career, Melissa Swift has specialized in helping leaders reshape their workforces for the future. Now a regular MIT SMR columnist, which we're super excited about, she's the author of the book, Work Here Now, Think Like a Human and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. Today, she'll talk about employee burnout and how to really overcome it. It's terrific to have you with us, Melissa. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And as miserable as burnout is, it's a favorite topic of mine to talk about because I think there's a lot we can do. All right. So let's get started. Burnout is, as we well know, right? It can seem to be a bit intractable, right? Of all the things that we have to grapple with in life, work burnout is, I think, one of the toughest. And so I'm going to talk today about what does research actually tell us about what you should do about burnout. We've all got our theories and, we have stuff that we like to say, oh, I do this and you could do that. But I'm going to be talking about it pretty systemically. And I'm going to try and present everything from a point of view of data and evidence, right? What does the data actually tell us about how do you combat this monster? So let's look at, number one, kind of the meta research. So fantastically for all of us, the Surgeon General actually went in and did sort of a big study about what actually makes for well-being at work, right? And it's interesting because there's a lot of different dimensions here. And probably everybody's looking at this visual going, well, I wouldn't have thought of X, right? And X is a different thing for each of us. But I want to talk a bit about this framework to begin with, because then we're going to hit these themes in different places throughout the whole presentation. So number one, and I think they put this at the top for a reason, protection from harm. A well workplace is basically a safe workplace. But it's interesting to think about how the definition of safety has changed. So safety might be, you need to wear a hard hat. But what's safety in knowledge work? Maybe safety is I'm not on 10, 30-minute Zoom meetings in a day in a row, right? Because that's actually hurting my brain. With greater and greater technology in the equation, we need to think through what is safe today, above and beyond kind of a lot of the safety protections that were honestly established in the early part of the 20th century. A lot of how we think about safety at work is completely true, but not necessarily contemporary. So we really got to think about safety. The second piece, I'm just going to go clockwise, is around connection and community, social support, belonging. And this is a really interesting one because, again, thinking about how technology has changed work, in some ways, for many of us, we saw this during the COVID period, right? Our jobs got more isolated and isolating. So if I'm, a remote worker, I could go all day without speaking to a human being face to face. And what is the impact that has on me? What if I'm a cashier and we go to self-checkout and I'm directing people in a line, but I'm not having those face-to-face conversations anymore? What does that do to my sense of connection and community? Again, we really got to think about how some of these pieces are changing. A third piece, and for any of us who are caregivers, this is going to resonate, work-life harmony. And that's not just flexibility, the second point, but I love that first point, autonomy. Part of what creates work-life harmony is not your employer making decisions for you about how it should all work together. It's you being able to make those decisions. The purple point, as we go clockwise, mattering at work. Am I treated with dignity? Does my work have meaning? And again, in a more technology-inflected world where technology might be kind of standing in between you and the results of your work, the meaning of your day-to-day activities, it becomes more and more critical. And can I connect those activities to results? And then finally, opportunity for growth. Am I accomplishing something? Am I learning things? Learning is a really interesting one to think about when we think about career pathing. Not everybody wants to move just up the career ladder. Particularly for newer generations in the workforce, there's a greater emphasis on lateral growth and lateral movement. So thinking about learning as an actual vector of well-being, I think is a very exciting concept. All right, so that's the kind of the big picture view. And now I'm going to move into a series of very concretely research-driven learnings about what might actually help us with this whole burnout thing. All right. So strategy number one, and anybody that knows my work knows I'm big on like, what are the strategies, right? So strategy number one, we got to kill bad work. But first, what's causing bad work? When I was doing research for my book, this was like an obsession of mine. And a big part of it is that work anxiety monster. So first, let me talk about the bad work. And then I'm going to talk about that guy on the right-hand side who's menacing, right? That poor worker, the work anxiety monster. So some recent studies have been fairly scathing on how badly we work, right? We don't set work up properly. 60% of a person's time on work is spent on work about work. How are we going to get this done? Let's have a meeting about how we're going to set up the meetings. Per my last email, right? We're all familiar with this. And fully 78% of employees in one survey said they spent too much time in meetings to actually get their work done, which is weird because meetings are supposed to help us get work done, right? Something's wrong. Okay. So all of this bad work is burning us out, right? If you think about on that prior slide, if I want to have meaning at work, meaning is not established by sitting through a million meetings, right? So why are we doing this? Well, my hypothesis is it's something called the work anxiety monster. It's that little voice in our heads. People aren't working fast enough. They're not working hard enough. And we do it to ourselves. We say, Melissa, you're not working fast enough. You're not working hard enough. And it generates all this like work about work. Let's schedule more meetings. Let's send more emails. Let's do all the things. And that's actually driving a lot of burnout. So if we could quell that central anxiety and say, okay, right? We're good. You're working fast enough. There is meaning to your work. Things are being accomplished. Things are getting done, and shut down a lot of the noise. That might really help burnout. All right. So another strategy, and I think this one is fundamentally related, and you'll see, sorry to be a wonky consultant here. These strategies are not mutually exclusive and completely exhausted, right? They are deeply interlinked. We got to attack greedy work. So greedy work, visualized on the right-hand side, is when work just becomes your whole life. It's eating into breakfast time. It's eating into dinner time. You're working on vacation. You're working on the weekends. Is greedy work important? Well, the woman who came up with it just won the Nobel Prize. So I would argue that this concept of greedy work is something that we need to talk about a little bit more. And what's interesting about Claudia Goldin's work, and I think she's an incredible luminary in this field, is that not just that she observed that we're working too much, right? I think any of us can observe that. But she detailed the economics of how we now pay people more to work too much. So that's a pretty straight line to burnout. It used to be 50 years ago, if you were guilty of overwork, right, you would actually get paid less. Lots of work was something for lower paid workers. Now, lots of work is something for executives. It's something for CEOs. You want to work 80 hours a week, we'll pay you more to do it, right? We're incentivizing burnout. And that's something we've got to look at. And we've got to look at the corrosive effect that greedy work has in terms of, again, driving those, back to the work-life harmony point, driving those caregivers out of the workplace, right? If work demands 80 hours of work a week, well, maybe I can't be a mom and an executive, right? Maybe I can't care for my aging parents and be an executive. There's all kinds of challenges to society and to life that greedy work presents above and beyond just burnout. A third strategy, and this has been a favorite one of mine to talk about recently, because it's just become so piquant, is I talk about this in my book, the idea of couples counseling for humans and technology. None of us are feeling good right now about the amount of technology we have to use at work. And it's not the amount of technology, right? We want the help. We want the augmentation, right? If ChatGPT can do a first draft of something for me, fantastic. If the implementation of a system, right, can help me have better data-driven conversations, love it. It's great. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is on the left-hand side. Again, going back to the data and the evidence, literally the number of apps you have to touch in a day at work has skyrocketed. And so it's not technology, it's switching between technology to technology to technology. I'm over here on Teams, and then I'm in this app, and I'm in that app, and I'm doing that, and people are pinging me here. And that's what your brain is cognitively struggling with. And that's another driver of burnout. So we've got to have that moment of renegotiation. what technologies are helpful, mission critical, have fantastic user interface, and are really flowed well into processes and workflows, and which ones are archaic, ancillary, annoying, right? A big piece of advice I give to companies is if your workers are annoyed, that's more of a tell than you think, right? That's not just a minor employee engagement issue. That's a major employee engagement issue, and it's a productivity issue. When we start to find technology is dragging us back, right? That's the moment for that couples counseling. And that's a moment when you really have to intervene to address burnout. Because a lot of times the very technology that is supposed to be helping us is burning us out. It's making us exhausted. All right. So a fourth strategy is we have to break the workforce copy machine. If you've ever studied kind of classical Freudian or analytical theory, there's something called the repetition compulsion. And that is literally the piece of human nature that compels us to do the same things over and over and over, even when we desperately want to change. Right? And sitting in companies today, sitting in businesses, we want to change, right? We know that current levels of burnout, frustration, exhaustion, attrition are unsustainable, right? Remembering that the US economy is still short a few million workers. We can't afford to have the amount of burnout we have. We got to do things differently. And the first step in doing things differently is being cognizant of the actual history of certain things in the workforce that's not so nice. So on the left-hand side, and it's difficult to see clearly because it's from a couple centuries ago, is an early performance management document. Okay, performance management sounds totally neutral. What it is it's a record of how much cotton each slave on a particular plantation picked. And we hear that and we go, oh, God, that's terrible. Researchers have established that much of modern performance management actually derives from absentee slaveholding practices. So if you're going through performance management, be it as a leader, be it as an employee, and there are certain aspects that you find to be driving burnout, it might be because this stuff is rooted in kind of some dark and gnarly history, right? Some unpleasant history. And so we've got to break that copy machine, right? We've got to say, what does modern, often team-based and collective performance look like? I mean, that's the interesting thing, is that performance in agrarian societies was measured on a farm level output, team output, until we got into slavery and thought that we owned individual human beings, right? So a lot of individual performance management comes from like a not great place. So it's worth thinking through, are there elements of that may be driving employee burnout as well, that putting so much on one individual's shoulders may not be the right thing. And we're seeing progressive companies really emphasize team-based outcomes to both increase productivity, increase worker happiness, and decrease burnout. So that's one where I think going back to the history books a bit can be very interesting. Another strategy is really around coming back to some of those themes about dignity at work and fairness. And so on the left-hand side, you've got my favorite movie from, I think at this point, more than 50 years ago, that's still, unfortunately, completely relevant today, which is 9 to 5. And so 9 to 5, which is fantastically based on a nonfiction book, which many people don't know. One of the major themes of that movie is that being treated unfairly at work is exhausting. It really burns you out. And that comes through so strongly in the movie. And what's great about this is that research bears this out. That researchers have established direct connections between being treated justly at work and burnout, and then job satisfaction, and then turnover, right? It goes straight to the bottom line, to those attrition numbers. And the interesting thing is there's different dimensions in that model, right? Are your procedures and policies fair and just, but also are the outcomes just? Are people interpersonally just? And I would connect this to the work of researchers like Bob Sutton, right? Where if people feel like there are jerks in the workplace and they're not fair, that burns you out. If you've ever had to deal with a jerk at work, again, It's exhausting. But that's not just an anecdotal feeling, right? Large-scale research and the movie 9 to 5 truly support that point of view. So when you're thinking about, again, working backward from the problem of burnout, it is absolutely worth looking at all of those kind of great equity levers. And remembering that equity, it's not just kind of pure demographic equity, which should be in 2024 cost of entry, but just different kinds of groups. Do people feel they are treated fairly? And paying attention when they say they're not, and looking at, again, across interpersonal dimensions, distributive dimensions, right? Are you distributing compensation fairly? All of these things. And really working backward toward, how does that hit my level of burnout? All right, so a couple more strategies. And again, this is the funny mixture of old and new that we see doing this work. So on the left-hand side, you've got I Love Lucy, right? And on the right-hand side, you've got some contemporary neuroscience research. So let me try to connect them. So one of the themes that I focus on a lot is work intensification. And work intensification is a great concept from the academic world that we sort of don't talk about enough in professional practice. And what work intensification is it's having to do too many units of work per unit of time. And so that could be, I am required to pick too many strawberries in an hour. That could be, I am required to be on too many Teams calls in a day. I am required to answer too many Slack messages, right? I'm required to answer too many emails. It's all about just squeezing too much into, the only thing that we have a limited supply of, really, which is time. And so there's a great I Love Lucy episode where the women switch jobs with their husbands, right, to see who has it harder, right? And that's a whole other thing. That's a fascinating concept for an I Love Lucy episode. But they end up on an assembly line trying to pack chocolates, and the assembly line starts going too fast. And so they're stuffing them in their mouths, they're stuffing them in their clothes just to get the chocolates off the assembly line. And in the end, their boss comes by, says, "Great job," and speeds the assembly line up. Which, who among us has not been there, right? It is the perfect commentary. So if you look at the neuroscience research on the right-hand side, that's your brain on too many back-to-back video calls. So see how it gets all red at the top and it's blue at the bottom when you have breaks in between? The neuroscience at the top is what happens when the assembly line is speeded up too fast. So we have to think about, should we de-intensify work? We have this kind of mentality of forever growth. Does work need to keep expanding and expanding and getting more compressed? And does the assembly line always have to go faster? Or back to that point about safety and security, are we hurting human workers? And maybe we need to slow down. And maybe we would be more productive if we actually slowed the assembly line down to the right speed and they weren't having to eat the chocolates. And finally, let's talk about metrics for a second, because I think this is really critical. And this is something that the research also hits pretty hard. You've got to get metrics for burnout in place. So there are things like, academically developed burnout scales. And if you look at that, oh my God, fatigued in the morning, waking up tired, that's pretty grim. I mean, that's amazing that is a part of the actual burnout scale. But then there are other things that you can look at. Right? I've seen organizations do things looking at things like the data on the right-hand side. Do people take their vacation? Not taking vacation can be both a driver of burnout and a sign of burnout. It's a tell, right? I can't stop working. I can't even take a minute off. Things like missing mandatory trainings, right? I can't stop working. I don't even have time to stop working to do this training that I actually really need to do that might be legally mandated. So thinking about in your workplace, what are the metrics that really show someone is burned out before you get to that point of you're actually hitting an academic burnout scale of I feel hopeless about my life and I'm exhausted in the morning and all of that stuff. I think that there's a final piece about, if you can't measure burnout, and critically, if you can't measure it early, before the point when people are physically sick or quitting or whatever it is, then you're never going to get your arms around it as a problem. So, as I'm kind of wrapping up the presentation piece here, I just want to emphasize think about metrics, think about things that you can measure, ideally quantitatively, because that's really where you're going to get a bit of a solve to the burnout question. All right, so I am wrapping up and happy to take some questions.
That's so interesting, Melissa. And I know that organizations everywhere are wrestling with this, that people are wrestling with this, especially coming out of the pandemic. I think that really accelerated things. And I just love your strategy number 6, to make work de-intensification a goal. We're really thinking about that a lot here, and it's hard to do. So my first question is, a lot of organizations still try to deal with burnout by putting in place wellness programs or offering different perks. And, those things are great, but they don't really address the problem as you've described. So how do you challenge leaders to look at the work culture and environment and the work itself as the problem, and to approach burnout more systemically?
Yeah, it's a great question. Great question. Because I'm not saying don't do any of the individual stuff, right? It's great if you can offer wellness apps and programs, and that's fantastic. Like, give people a toolkit. Awesome. But it's necessary but not sufficient. The systemic look is what's, truly going to get us there. And to do that, honestly, from having worked through this topic with a lot of organizations, some of it is getting executives to self-reflect. That when you get them to sort of pause and sit down and think about what drives their own moments of burnout, and to push them some of this rhetoric, right? Like, we really, how you get ahead. Well, I'm fine. I'm indestructible. Or get them out of that, right? Get them into a moment where, let's talk about a moment when you were tired, and then talk about all the things that led up to you just feeling so exhausted. Leaders are smart. They can totally get there, but I think they first have to have those epiphanies at C-suite level, right? About, okay, if that makes me tired, imagine how it makes my, tens of thousands of junior employees feel, right? It's got to be even worse from them. I, as the CEO, have the maximum control over my own work, right? It just gets worse from there on. So if I feel terrible, how must they feel? And I think it's that moment of reflection. And then you can start talking about what are the big systemic changes you need to make.
Yeah, I loved your slide with the work draping over everything.
Feels that way, right?
Yeah. I once had dinner with an executive roundtable dinner kind of thing. And he had his phone on the table and was taking texts and calls. And he said, my wife really doesn't like it when I do this, but he thought his work was so important that he had to do that. I wonder if he's still married. So can you, so we're getting some good questions from the audience. And would you speak a little bit more to the metrics for burnout issue?
Yeah, this is a super interesting one, because these metrics are, a lot of the metrics that we conventionally look at are kind of endpoint metrics, right? Like, I'm engaged or I'm not. By the time somebody is a disengaged employee, right, there were 20 things you could have done leading up to that, let's face it. So even within, let's say, the construct of a traditional, engagement survey, there's always a question about, I have the tools I need to do the work I need to do. And that sounds really banal. It's actually kind of boring, right? So a lot of times we skip, the tools, maybe they do. No. That's an early tell for burnout, right? Mm-hmm. Because when I don't have the tools I need, the human, I tend to go the extra mile. Like, that's the nice thing about sort of people versus technology. Technology will do exactly what you circumscribe for it to do. People will do extra, and people doing extra, sometimes that's good and that's awesome. That's discretionary energy, but sometimes that's burnout. So starting to look at some of the really fundamental pieces of how work gets done. And also on a metrics basis, just kind of taking an ethnographic approach and saying the little details of people's day, matter. So, okay, the average badge out time used to be 6:30 in the office, and now it's 7. Something simple like that could be a real tell for burnout, because that might be, back to the greedy work point, that might be tipping over into, you just totally missed dinner, right? Instead of coming in the middle. So looking at little things and boring things that have to do with everyday work, I think that's part of the key to metric success, to be honest.
You mentioned the shift to team-based outcomes, and there's a question. Where did it go? Svetlana was wondering, how do you address the free rider issues that come along with team-based metrics?
Yeah, this question, this is always the first question to come up about team-based metrics, right? Because nobody likes a freeloader at work, right? That's no fun for any of us. And it's a driver of burnout, by the way, right? If you have genuine free riders, they are exhausting everyone around them. This is where I'm seeing some really great kind of developments in team governance, things like team contracts, where you basically empower the team to manage themselves. And at that point, people are pretty good at making sure everybody else gets their work done, right? If the team's a truly self-managing unit and you don't have a heavy-handed boss at the top who feels like they have to puppet master everybody, then people tend to work that out among themselves, and free riders tend to get quickly signaled or managed. And the interesting thing is that if you think about it, at different times, every one of us is going to need to be a free rider, right? Back to that example of caregivers, right? My kid's sick this week. I need to be a little bit of a free rider, but I'm here for you next week, right? When, you've got to help your aging parent move out of their house. And so some of it is really looking at, are there genuine free rider issues, or is there temporary ebb and flow that a good self-managing team can kind of work around and support each other, back to some of those points about kind of connection and community.
Terrific. And that goes to the whole, just how do we manage our work as a group versus individually, just in my silo? Excuse me. So let's see, we've got a couple more good questions here. In a job market where there are thousands of applicants for each open position, what's the incentive for management to cut down on burnout?
Well, so this is the thing, though. That's a bit of a myth, right? We're structurally short millions of workers. There are not necessarily thousands of applicants for every position. And I think this is where we've all got to kind of long-term reorient our thinking. Birth rates are not going up. Birth rates are going down. We are never going to have as many human workers as we have at this point in history right now. It's going this way. And I'm not convinced that, technology augmentation tends to increase, if anything, the number of jobs, not decrease. So it's not like robots are taking your jobs. So some of it is we need to actually move to a point of view that human talent is scarce and increasingly precious, and operate accordingly. So sort of the flip side of that, a related question, and I think this will be our last question, and we might have time for one more. How do you effectively communicate to upper management that you're working with, that when they're downsizing, but the work isn't downsizing, how they need to adjust? Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a one-word answer, which is prioritization. And most companies stink at it. I was once in a meeting with an executive team where somebody said very seriously, we have 37 priorities in this company. And I was like, oh, ha, ha, ha. No. They had a list of 37, right? And at 37 priorities, I'm sorry, you don't have any priorities at all. That is not prioritization. And again, companies don't connect this back to, they're like, why are we not productive? Well, productive against what? If you're trying to do too many things, yeah, none of them are going to feel productive, right? We've all had those moments when we overloaded our own days and we felt like we didn't get anything done. That happens on a company level. And if you're at a moment of cost containment, if you're at a moment of downsizing, that's the double down on your critical strategic priorities moment. But companies often don't take that second step to say, okay, this number of people can actually get this done, but this is what's crucial to our business. Again, it's getting rid of that anxiety monster kind of more is more thinking.
Fantastic. So much good advice, information, things to think about. Thank you so much, Melissa, for being with us today. And we wish you the best.
Thank you. It was a treat to do this. Always happy to talk about this topic.
All right. Thanks so much. In our next session, Malia Lazu will talk about why DEI efforts often fail to live up to their promise, and how to move from good intentions to real impact in the face of pushback and resistance. Malia is a lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management and author of the recently published book, From Intention to Impact, a Practical Guide to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. As a fellow at MIT's Community Innovators Lab, she launched the Urban Labs to help brands reap returns on diversity. She's the founder and CEO of the Lazu Group. Welcome, Malia.
Thank you so much, Abby, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here, and it's been great to see Melissa's conversation. I think we're going to slide right in and talking about DEI leadership and how do we actually get there? What does it take to get real change? So I look forward to the conversation. My name's Malia Lazu, as you heard, and I am a lecturer at Sloan and have just written a book about how we actually move from DEI intention to impact. And I'm going to talk about why this is important, us understanding the history of what we're going up against, and then finally how we actually move from intention to impact. So the first thing that I think is important for everyone to remember is that America is not in the process of changing. America has changed. When we look at the US population, we can see demographically, America has changed, but we can also see that we're in the middle of a intergenerational conversation. I think often of Archie Bunker, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, wait, is our generation the Archie Bunker? What's happening here? We used to be the meatheads. But what we see is that millennials and younger feel differently about inclusion. They feel differently about how people should be included not only in the workplace, but in society. And this matters because, as Melissa said, the millennials are the largest generation since the boomers, and they are going to continue to make their mark in the same way that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers did. So how are we talking about DEI right now? Well, we know we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. There's a lot of politics around that. What we're seeing from the business side is a term called ESG. I'm sure many folks are familiar with ESG. It's a growing industry, as you can see here. And the opportunity here, ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. And I like to say that the S is still really mushy. How we define social is still really up for grabs. And I think an opportunity for a lot of us to define what we mean by social and how we support society and social movements. So, you know, I like to say I come out of organizing. Actually, I worked for Harry Belafonte for several years, and to find myself a bank president and now a business consultant and a lecturer at Sloan has been a really interesting journey. And as I talk about DEI, what I often hear is that it's the right thing to do. And I think that is, right? I think diversity, equity, and inclusion is the right thing to do. A lot of people go to work, though, for money. And what we've been hearing for years and years is that business is about profitability. And I think what we found over the last 10 years is that DEI is actually profitable, right? And, you know, there's a bunch of different stats that you can look at. Some are here. McKinsey Diversity Matters is where a lot of these stats come from. The $16 trillion stat is a Citibank stat. So these aren't stats produced by the NAACP or by the National League of Women, right? These are business consultants seeing that diversity, equity, and inclusion is actually beneficial, not only internally, but externally as well. So what is the history? Now, this is just one timeline, the timeline of slavery. If I had more time, I would, go through others. But when we look at the history of the U.S. and the United States, what we see is that it's been a history of fighting for inclusion. And our actual inclusion has really just started in the 60s, right? And for women, if this was a chart for women, you could even start creating a new pie, right? Of this new era of women having less rights than they did after Roe. So what we're going up against is really American culture, right? And we know who's included by looking at our founding documents, right? Enslaved people were 3/5 of a person. We have, Indians being called savages, and women aren't even mentioned, right? So that's the house. And when I think about our culture, I think about a wonderful West African tale of the elephant and the giraffe. And they were friends. They would hang out in the watering hole. They would talk about the cricket. And one day the giraffe is like, "Elephant, come into my house. Come and hang out with me. We'll watch the cricket together." And the elephant's like, "I'd love to visit." So the giraffe runs home and goes and cleans his house, makes sure that there's no mice, brings in extra peanuts. He wants his elephant friend to feel welcome. And the elephant is walking to his house, excited to go in. He reaches up his trunk and he grabs grasses from the highest of trees, the way the giraffe likes. And he goes to the house. And the giraffe welcomes him in. And what happens? Boom. The elephant can't fit. Right? And the giraffe says, "No, come into my house. Push, push." And he starts breaking the house, the elephant. And the giraffe says, "Stop. You're breaking my house. I need you to lose weight in order to come into my house." And the elephant says, "But I'm an elephant. I can't possibly lose enough weight to fit in a house that's built for a giraffe." And this story about the elephant and the giraffe really sums up what we're trying to do when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just about inviting someone in. It's about understanding what has been established and how you feel about what has been established, right? This story right here, how you understand this timeline, affects how welcoming your house is to different people. And so when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what we're actually talking about is how do we build a house that everyone feels welcome, that everyone sees something familiar, that everyone knows that in a certain way they're a part of this group. So what is equity, right? We talk so much about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity gets thrown in there in a way that I think has us lose its true meaning, right? Because diversity is a thing, right? You can't do anything about diversity. Mother Nature did something about diversity, right? Inclusion is what you decide to do. Do you include or do you not? But as the recent spate of, 911 calls on Black students in Ivy League universities, you can be included, but still not belong, right? And belonging is what you actually need to get equity. Equity is the how. Equity allows people to bring themselves to work. And that's really the magic. If you know you can thrive somewhere, you will bring your whole self to work and you will help your company, get to these goals get to these metrics that we see, right? That McKinsey and others put out. So what actually happens, right? Everyone, I work with a lot of different companies and, no one has ever said like, we don't want women, right? We don't want people with different lived experiences. However, actually moving the needle, right? To move from the intention of wanting to see these numbers or wanting to enter new markets, right? To actually getting there. There's these stages that companies go through, and a majority of companies stay between stages 1 and 4. And what you see, I like to call 1 through 3 the honeymoon period, right? What you see is the first stage, you decide you can do something. So maybe you sign a pledge, right? And you're excited. So you start to learn about it, right? You start to maybe do a training. And then you realize that you can take action on low-hanging fruit. Maybe you're doing a hire and you want to think about, can that be a person who brings in a different lived experience, right? And so you start to take action on low-hanging fruit, right? And what happens is that your culture starts pushing back, right? A culture, as Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and your best diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy will get eaten for breakfast by your culture. So, the first step of pushback, and there's 3 steps here about pushback. But the first stage is that it feels like legitimate pushback, right? Oh, well, we just need to run this through compliance. We just need to make sure that we can do this. And you start answering the pushback, and then more pushback comes. And it's in this stage that you start to want to question, what is this pushback, right? What is this pushback legitimate? Or is this the culture actually trying to reset itself, right? And so once you realize that this is the culture resetting itself, right? And you understand that what's happening is it's not a legitimate question to ask if you're going to hire less qualified people because you want to have a diverse slate, right? Like that's actually a privileged question, right? You start realizing that these questions are sitting in the concern of the majority. And then you have to make a decision, right? You have to then make a decision if you're going to push through that or if you're going to let the pushback win. And there's a great quote that whenever I think about moving through pushback by Barbara Clark, who is a very, very strong female entrepreneur, supporter, investor. And she says she, sits with men all the time. And it says, are you going to finally write the damn check? Like you've asked these women questions that you haven't asked the men. Are you finally going to write the check? And pushing through that is really, really important. So what can you do? And how can you actually think about diversity, equity, and inclusion in your own mind and in your own self? And this is a process that we created right after George Floyd. And part of what we were wanting to do was to create something that people could just take. At the time, if you remember, folks were trying to figure out what they could do, right? They were trying to figure out how they could support a community feeling terrorized. A lot of companies were making pledges, right? If you remember, Jamie Dimon took a knee. There was many examples of wanting to support a community that had just been terrorized. But the first reaction was to ask the community what they needed, right? And again, burdening the community with their own inclusion is something that's not equitable, right? So at the end of the day, we created this in a way to think about how to get into right relationships with communities that you may not have, relationships with. And the first is to listen. You want to seek out communities. You want to seek out conversations that are happening with new communities for you, right? Because these communities might be new to you and what they've been asking for, their agenda might be new to you, but it's not new to them, right? If we think about the conversation that Black people have been having about police, it's centuries old, right? So this idea of not knowing what to do really means that you haven't been listening to what the community is saying. So what's great now is that there's a lot of podcasts, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can hear the community's voice. There's actually a great, I don't want to say resurgence because I don't know if it was ever there, but culturally with us learning about the disability community, Crip Camp is an amazing movie that was done from the voices of people with disabilities, and it can help you understand their struggle. For a time where we were saying we couldn't afford to put up ramps because it would have, it would be way too costly, if you can imagine, right? That the ADA would have pushback. Listening helps you understand. And then once you listen, you can come into the community and listen to the solutions that they already have. So often people think that they already know the answers. They think that, well, you know what you need to do. You know what we're going to do to help this community. You know what we're going to do to make sure that Black women feel welcome in our company. These types of postures do not build belonging, right? Because I guarantee you that people have gone home and said, you know what they need to do, right? People already have an idea of how they would like to be included and how they would like to see others act towards them. So learning that, listening to be changed, right? Like understanding that there's something here for you to learn and be a part of the solution that they're leading is really important to stay in right relationship. And then lastly, love, right? And, so often once you listen and learn, you have to take action. What else can you do? But it's important to remember that not all action is relevant, helpful, or good for the community that you're taking action on. And so making sure that the action that you're taking is loving, making sure that you are using at the end of the day, that you are using and taking loving action, you are using solutions that communities want you to use is really critical. And an example here of us not getting the 3 L's right as a country is actually the George Floyd conversation. And when we acted, we made Juneteenth a federal holiday, which is not what the Black community was asking for. They were asking for a police reform bill, right? So the idea of a Juneteenth holiday is a response to the killing of George Floyd, might seem like action, but it's really irrelevant action to a community that had a police reform bill and that continues to ask for police reform. So that's just one example of how you can think you're taking action, and really what you're doing is reinforcing your own power and your own privilege. So I am very much looking forward to the conversation and questions that you might have. I want to end with a thank you and reminding all of us that there's a lot of pushback on DEI right now, but it's really, really important for us to remember to remain competitive in a global economy. We have the biggest strength here is our diversity.
Malia, thank you so much. And is that QR code a link to your book or?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic. Which the book, by the way, was published in collaboration with MIT SMR. So I'm really happy to be part of that. Questions have come up that really get to different parts of your talk. And what I loved about your talk was that you address it from both the organizational perspective, what do organizations need to do, but then what can we as individuals do? So the first question is, this macro context tells us that the real challenge is to dismantle a deeply entrenched culture that does not believe in equity, et cetera. In your opinion, what are the most effective interventions in helping neutralize and dismantle this deeply entrenched culture that enshrines the status quo and intends to prevent progress? I know that's a lot to cover quickly, but there's a lot in there. But if you could just take a crack at that.
Yeah. So the question is, what are some of the best practices in an interpersonal, not necessarily an organizational?
I think this was the organizational, because it was about culture, dismantling an entrenched culture that does not believe in equity.
Yes. Well, right. And, so I think it's important to remember that there are places where you can affect change and there are places where you can't, right? And you don't want to put yourself in harm's way. I joke around and say Jesus only had 12 disciples. You don't need everybody. This idea of who you're talking to, why you're talking to them, why you're trying to change your culture is really important to understand, because it's not easy, right? It's not easy to do. And then you want to reach out and organize with the people who are already feeling the way you do, right? And like what we know, for everyone who wants to get into the politics of DEI, most companies know that more people buy Starbucks on the first Tuesday of November than vote. And those are the numbers they're looking at, right? They care about employees and consumers. They don't, you know what I mean? That's what they care about. And they've seen, right, what their customers and their employees are asking for. So, whether it's employee resource groups, right? You start working with the pre-existing networks of people who actually want to make change. And then you start just doing it, right? So take the 3 L's, for example. And in this group, do the 3 L's, right? Read a book together, listen to a couple of podcasts together, right? Talk about the history. I don't know if people have seen the recent history of busing that was out on the American Experience, but one of the gentlemen who was protesting the integration of schools became a civil rights activist, and was talking in this movie and saying that he didn't understand what the Black community had been asking for, right? He had never heard that. And so listening and learning as a group will help you take actions that will really make a difference. Modeling the behavior, getting curious, building empathy, right? These are all things that we need deeply in our country, and they're ultimately what builds belonging.
This question is, it's an interesting question, and I'm going to rephrase it. So when you have pushback, and there has been some sort of overall backlash against DEI recently, and so there's this conversation about why are we doing DEI, and there's some faction that is like, okay, well, we need to focus on what are the business outcomes of that, versus we're people, and we do this because this is important to us as a team, as a culture. So can you talk a little bit about that, sort of the business impact versus the this is something we should do?
Yeah, I have a section in my book that asks the question, are we greedy or are we racist, right? Are we greedy or are we sexist? Are we greedy or are we homophobic? And we really are getting to the basis of that question, right? And greed for so long was an acceptable posture of business because that's what they did. I'm not saying I agree with it, all right? But that was sort of, oh, well, we got to do this for the shareholders. It's fiduciarily responsible. And we're now getting to the point where people are understanding that their kids are asking them for clean water and clean air, right? Like their kids are asking them for a different world. And they need to be able to get there. But the other thing is that if you do believe in fiduciary responsibility, then this idea that the smartest room is going to be a room full of able-bodied, straight, white men, it just doesn't make sense. I mean, there's no other place in your life where you don't have diversity, right? Your investments are diverse, right? Your revenue streams are diverse. Like diversity, your biology, right? Your biological tree should be diverse. Like we understand the benefits of diversity in so many other ways, but because of our narrative, we get caught up. So there's a lot of pushback right now because of the organized movement, right? It was decided just like during Reagan, right? I mean, Reagan released over 200 amicus briefs or something like that, right? Pushing for an end of affirmative action. there's always been this pushback, right? And it's happening again now. I think the difference is that the younger generations are trying to have a different conversation, right? It's really inevitable. And so you can, you can be the old person yelling at clouds, or you can understand that the world is moving forward, understanding itself differently, especially in places that have an interconnectivity.
A number of the questions came in around the pushback. And I loved your graphic, and maybe we can just go back to that for a minute, because I think 3 or 4 of the items on your graphic there had to do with pushback, with recognizing it, with addressing it. And could you talk maybe a little bit more about the sort of what's under there? What's the hardest part of that, and what have successful leaders done to take that on?
Yeah. I was working with a group of CEOs, and they were trying to do some, supportive work of, different leadership, blah, 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 in a diverse way. And so they each were being a mentor for someone else. And what was fascinating was things that they used to be able to get done quickly, right? All of a sudden there would be pushback, right? There would be questions, there would be, conversation. And for them, like, they don't really get pushback, right? And so they were very quickly able to connect the dots of like, okay, this is happening because, right, of the person that I'm trying to push in the room, the person I'm trying to get into the room. So pushback is natural. That happens with this. And I think, when we talk about the stages, is because at first the pushback is legitimized. And I think that's that's the worst thing that you can do, right? Is think like, oh, well, they're just playing devil's advocate. You can't play devil's advocate to someone's humanity, right? It's just a really awkward thing to do. And not allowing for that pushback to go too far. We actually suggest that people put out a set of FAQs, that lay out, right, that have the McKinsey studies, right, that lay out this information so that people won't have the assumptions that they have about what DEI will do, and so, yeah, I think that the pushback, what we're asking people to do is change their narrative, right? And that is probably one of the hardest things to do, is to change how you understand yourself in this world. And a lot of straight white men say, well, where's the place for me? Where's the place for me? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, but not center it. The West has done enough damage. I think, continuing to center hurt feelings might not help progress.
Very good point. Following on the pushback conversation, so are there specific, well, actually, this question here around sort of language. Language has become, I think Jim Dietert said it at the beginning of the event today, language has become weaponized to some extent. And so as new terms come up, people grab onto them and give them the meaning that they want to give it. So how do you move forward with what you're talking about, with creating this movement, this culture of acceptance and welcoming, with addressing the language, with the words people are using?
How do I think about language?
Yeah, so woke, for example, has become a very negative term in a lot of people's minds, when it was a very positive was a positive thing.
Right.
So within an organization, how do you sort of navigate that shift in language? I think you talked a little bit about it just a minute ago in terms of, just being upfront and forward with your intentions.
Right. I think so, and I know we're at time, so I'll be quick with this one. I think language and deconstructing the weaponization of language is really, really important, because right now folks are saying like, oh, we need to cross out the term Black, we need to cross out the term woman, we need to cross this out, right? Not understanding the years that it took to actually get that term in.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, to be flippant about it, right? To allow words to be appropriated the way they are, I think is something really unfortunate. And whenever you can deconstruct that for someone, I also think that depending on where you are, again, I think if you're in certain echo chambers, you can think that it's a lot worse than it is. I just went around the country and doing this book tour and had wonderful conversations with people who don't like, this woke, this conversation and this attack on woke, that actually appreciate what little bit of interconnectedness we've been able to build.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Malia. Really appreciate it. Love your work, and we'll keep that going.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
In our next session, we'll hear from Peter Capelli, the George W. Taylor Professor of Management and Director of the Center for Human Resources at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He recently wrote an excellent article for us on the topic that he's going to be speaking on that I think you should be able to find in the Handouts tab. Peter has taken a hard look at how generative AI tools, particularly large language models, could affect jobs or reshape roles. So please welcome Peter.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Nice to be here and to see you all. I am maybe a little farther than some of you away. I'm in London right now. You can tell I'm in London because I have a giant window next to me and every light in the room is on and it's still gloomy. So we'll live with that. Let's see if we can get underway. We have a poll question for you folks first. We'd like to see how you folks are actually using generative AI stuff now. So let's see if we can take this poll. And I think one of the reasons we want to see this is because the evidence on this is quirky and seems to change a lot depending how the questions are asked. And these are really asking you not about all IT, and it's not about machine learning here either. It's just generative AI stuff. Are you using it? And if so, in what role? So I think there's a quiz going on for you right now, and it will come up in just a minute. And this is a poll where you can vote more than once. You can vote on every one of these if you're doing them. And if you're not, just vote on the ones that look like you. Okay? So this will take us just a little bit to get all the votes in. As we sometimes say, vote early and vote often. No, let's see what the results look like. And they're still coming in a little bit. It looks like the big winner is individual employees are playing with generative AI tools on their own, some experimentation going on, some specific tasks, a few places where employees are we're performing tasks that employees had done before, and 3% are saying most have changed as generative AI has taken over many of their tasks. Okay, that's interesting to see, and I think what it tells us is some stuff going on for sure. The world has not shifted for most employers yet, it looks like. And it doesn't look like a lot of jobs have been eliminated. Some change. 10% of employees are using this in some way in the workplace. So it's interesting to see. Let's see if we could move on from the poll now. And let me tell you a little bit about what we are going to talk about in my session. I should tell you, this is done with my colleagues, Valeria Yakubovich and Sunny Tambi, all at the Wharton School, where we've been looking first at machine learning a little while ago, and now we're looking at generative AI. Let me tell you what's different about what we're doing. We're starting with what work needs to be done rather than starting with what is it that generative AI can do. Because it turns out that there's many things generative AI could do that we don't really need doing. And the projections from the tech side are often spectacularly wrong. In fact, most of the technology forecasts about work have been wrong over time. Now, why? Let's pick one, driverless trucks and driverless cars. Why have they been so far wrong? It's easy to forget now that just a few years ago, 2018 or so, the predictions were that driverless trucks are going to take over by 2019 in a couple of years, right? And we barely see any. Why was that so wrong? Well, because they began the projection based on what is it possible that driverless trucks could do rather than what needs to be done and rather than what is required for it to happen. All the regulations that have to be cleared, the insurance issues, the software issues, and all those issues. And if you look at the actual work, truck drivers do also lots of things other than just driving the trucks, even on long haul trucking. And so if you thought about it that way, maybe the projections would not have been quite so off, but that's where we're going to start. So let me see if we can jump in here and tell you 3 issues that we see in large language models in particular, which are getting most of the attention, like ChatGPT, which are caveats to the general optimism of what the things are that they could do, right? The first thing is there are lots of things that large language models could do that probably don't need doing. And let me give you an example of this. One of the things you often hear is they can easily write the kind of correspondence that we get from corporations and businesses and things like that. The caveat there is no human is writing those now. Those are virtually all form letters. And you might say they could do it too. Yes, they could, but why? A form letter has the advantage of lawyers have already cleared it, and anything that would be written by a large language model that a company wants to send out is probably got to be seen by a lawyer, and that is not going to be any kind of a time saver, particularly as opposed to a form letter. Could they do better than chatbots are with customer service? Yes, they could, but most organizations don't want better customer service. There's an interesting article about this in the Harvard Business Review a little while ago about why the way it's organized now, the chatbots saves employers and businesses money. They don't want chatbots to give employers solve more of their problems. You may have seen the Air Canada story about this, where Air Canada's chatbots were giving customers fares that the airline didn't like, and they tried to walk them back, and the court said, no, you can't. You're stuck with them. Another thing to think about on these issues of replacing people is that it's not so clear that large language models are going to be as cheap as they are now for very long. And as you probably know, if you're using them intensively, they're not so cheap right now. There are things that are free still, but we're throttling back what they can do. And the ultimate cost of these things, as more people use it, computer space has to go up. Electricity demands along are big. Somebody's got to pay for that. Let's look at the second one. And the second one is, can we validate the output of a large language model, ChatGPT, like reporter output, right? These things are most useful, again, not for writing simple correspondence, but for writing some kind of report about things we don't know much of anything about. That's fine if you don't care how good the report is. You're just trying to amuse yourself. Maybe you'll learn something. But if you're going to use it for something, you better be sure that it's right. And how are you going to know whether it's right? Well, it helps to have an expert, as somebody who can independently validate and know something about the topic, to look at it and say, yeah, no hallucinations here, no reliance on quirky outcomes. It is up to date. It's not weighting the information that is in the internet. Most of it's dated. You got to be able to assess that. Now, I know some people say you could use other large language models to assess that, but that is more a reliability issue than a validity issue. So we got to check this somehow. And this is not necessarily easy or cheap to do if you're using these for any tasks that really kind of matter. Okay. Here's the third issue, and that is because it's pretty easy to generate reports and output from these models. The cost goes down. You get more of them. You're going to get more responses. Here's why that matters. Let's say I generate a report that says something about your department and the need for it that you don't particularly like. A smart thing for you to do is just go generate your own report. And one of the things we know is you ask a different large language model, the same prompt, you're going to get a different answer. Even asking the same prompt on a different day, you're not going to get an identical answer. So this is a kind of reliability issue. So what would you do with your report? You generate one that makes your division look better, and you give that to the boss. He's already got my report. Now he's got 2 reports, and he's got to sort them out. This is like making judgments about 2 conflicting expert witnesses where you can't interview the experts and ask them why they have differences in their results, right? Even the people who build these models can't tell you those answers in any clear-cut way, right? So that's another problem. Are we going to drown people with adjudicating the differences in these outputs? What are large language models really good at right now? The best thing they're good at, I think, is writing college term papers. But there's a reason for thinking about why they're good at that. The first thing is the questions that we ask are ones for which there's already lots of information out there, and usually lots of good information. The second thing is they don't have to be very good. They just have to be kind of good enough. And we can generally kind of tell how good they are if you know something about the topic. So for students, they're really good, which is why we are dropping them, I think. And how we're going to teach people how to write and ultimately think from writing remains an open question for us. They're probably really good for entrepreneurs who have a low base rate. I really don't know much about marketing. I got to learn something about it. Let's ask ChatGPT to tell me. The answer just has to be okay, and I'll be way better off than I was before. But it's also fair to say you could have done that with a textbook, and you might have done it simply with a Google search as well. Where I think they're most useful is going to be analyzing our own data as an organization, because we are awash in data right now that we haven't been able to analyze ourselves. It's going to be way better at doing that than we are, easier. But still, there's a lot of background work that has to be done before database management in particular, but also a bunch of issues about concerns about guardrails, concerns about data pollution issues that somebody's got to worry about and take care of before we start even analyzing our own data. Okay? So let me remind you about something, and that is what's happened with the predecessor here, and that's machine learning with numbers, which I think has been remarkably underused. And let me tell you why it's been underused. Some part of this is database management questions. It takes a lot of effort to get the data together so that you could analyze it. Data is often in different silos in organizations, which are politically difficult as well as just technically difficult to put together. So think about this example, which I borrowed, I'm crediting, from Jeff Polzer at the Harvard Business School, about making a promotion decision. And you have, as part of the evidence, a machine learning algorithm, and let's say the algorithm is pretty good, to look at candidates and tell you how closely they fit the attributes of people who have succeeded before. And by the way, that's about as good as we're going to get in predicting hiring, right? And I've asked this question lots and lots of times of people. And if you give them a choice between picking somebody they know and kind of like, and picking somebody with a higher score in the algorithm, they almost always go with the person they like. If you increase the gap, the difference in the algorithm score, it doesn't change very many minds. The reason this matters is people want to be able to pick the person that they like. I don't think that's a good thing as somebody who studies the workplace, but it seems to be overwhelmingly true. And could the large language models be used to predict who will be a good hire? Yeah, they could be, but machine learning could already do that for us. We're not using it. And I think if you built the model, you would find that your line managers who right now are making the decision don't want to use it. So there's another opportunity or example of something, if you build it, they won't necessarily come. Right? So is this going to lead to substantial job losses? We believe, maybe even more than my colleagues, I believe, probably not. And there are many reasons why that's the case. Let's just walk through some of them. First of all, it only cuts jobs if the thing you're going to use it for is something that people are currently doing as employees. If it's something that is in addition, we're not doing now, that's great, but it's not going to cut jobs. Move to our second one here. It is the case that jobs have multiple tasks as part of them, and technology typically automates one task. So you see lots and lots of these papers now saying, you know, this technology could take over this main task of somebody. But even if you look at computer programming, interesting evidence suggests that programmers spend the majority of their time doing things that don't have anything to do with computer programming. They're talking to people, they're negotiating budgets and all that kind of stuff. And even on the quote programming side, not all of that is actual programming, right? And then we have the problem of, even if it's going to take over some of your tasks, say 10% of your work, can you cut 10% of an employee? You usually can't, because they're doing other things, right? And the only case you can easily see where increasing productivity will cut jobs is if you have a typing pool like organization. You have lots of people doing identical tasks interchangeably, and that you could just shift the tasks around until you got 100% equivalent of one person, and then you could get rid of a person, right? If that's not the case, increasing productivity per se is not going to cut jobs in your current organizations. Right? Our last one here is just a reminder that these new tasks that are going to be performed, and some of the work that would be taking over existing tasks, generate new work. Right? People have to manage databases. They got to organize your material to work with. They got to resolve these problems of dueling reports and validity and all those sorts of things. So it's going to generate a lot of new tasks. Somebody's going to have to do those, right? The last point, which is my, I guess, sense of practical stuff here, what should we be doing now for the workplace? One is we need acceptable use policies. If you don't have them in place already, how are you going to use these tools? Here's the first thing you should do, I think, is require that anybody who's using them has to acknowledge whether they were using them in the report or document they're sending to you, and that they have checked them for validity and tell you how they did it, right? We should have that as part of our acceptable use policies. We need to be training people on how to use them, in part so they understand the limitations. You don't necessarily learn that just from practicing. An open question, it seems to me, as to whether we need a central office, at least for a while, to conduct these analyses, because there's lots of open questions that beginners can't answer themselves. And we have all these possible complications that come from bad output that somebody who's experienced might be able to head off. So I think that's our takeaway at the end. They're not wildly exciting takeaways. They're pretty straightforward things, but we are not doing them right now in most organizations. I guess the real open question is whether you should have a central office do this. We have moved away from a lot of central control on technology, but I think there's a need at the moment for something like this. Maybe we don't need it for long. We can make it go away. But at the moment, I would think hard about doing that. So let me see if I could pause there and turn it back, I think, to Elizabeth.
Great stuff. And really, I think that your presentation is cutting directly to the questions that are most immediately on people's minds about how do we use this? How do we apply this? And I liked your turning the question around because I think that we have been so focused on, what can this thing do? And, in some ways that reflects an approach to innovation that is very much in the tech industry of one of, we built something cool. Let's see what we can do with it, as opposed to, we got a problem. Where's some smart ways to solve it? you know. So I actually have this is a question that we did not ask earlier, and I thought it was I think frankly this is a question that came in for Ethan, but it's it's very much a question for, I think, somebody like you who has a long experience in research in HR and and talent, and this is that especially when we think of leadership qualities and the traits that we develop for so much of what we how we are formed, I think, and how we form leaders is around analyzing and understanding research, making design decisions, marketing flair. There's so many so many processes, ways that we add value, I think, that people feel are threatened, I think, with the use of generative AI in particular. Does generative AI require us to, and the implication that it has for how we use it, does that require that we rethink our models of performance and of what skills we want to train for and select for, I guess, in leaders and senior staff?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, it's always possible that things will evolve so that these tools can exercise something that looks like judgment. Part of the problem, if you ask top leaders about decisions, is we, particularly in business schools, but even more so outside of business schools, think business leaders are rational, calculating machines, who are just writing analyses in their heads the whole time. But, they're political animals dealing with problems that require political solutions. We got this client over here who is super important, but we got to deal with this regulator over there, and this is what she particularly likes, and how do we balance all these things? We could be better at that stuff than we are, for sure, but I don't think that the tool that we have now in data science is helping us with that. Maybe it would at some point. Maybe some will be able to make judgments and weigh these different sets of factors, which are not easily condensed into data. Maybe we'll get that, but I don't think we are now. And that's what, you want leaders to do. The rational calculating part, you don't want leaders to do that. You got lots of young people coming out of business school who do that for them, right? They're making judgments. Right.
Okay. And by the same token, I want to also reprise something that we discussed a little earlier today, but I think that you're in a position to have a particularly informed view on it. And that's the concern about, if we treat especially LLMs like so the junior partner, the intern, this concern that we are automating away important tasks in which people learn the fundamentals of the job and how do we deal with that? What are your thoughts there?
That is a really good question. I think the accountants have concluded that they're seeing problems in this area. For sure, lawyers have. It's not new for lawyers, right? Because they've had software for a while that will assemble cases for you. You don't have to read through the cases. I think it's true for academics as well. You can do a literature search with Google that will pull up the relevant articles for you and what people have said about them before, people actually having to read the articles, right? Which is not a good thing. I don't know how we back up on that. We are certainly losing something. We are gaining in terms of productivity. And until we can measure that loss, we probably aren't going to see anything done about it, because it helps with things that we can measure, which is how quickly can you turn this brief around. Now, lawyers have a complicated issue there because they bill by the hour, right? So things that make them more productive might cost them money. But I don't think they can justify not using these right now. It's a really important question. I don't know what we do about it. It's also like getting rid of term papers. I'm not sure how we're going to help students learn how to organize their thoughts and make judgments in the absence of writing term papers. We don't know yet, what's going to do that. So it's a problem.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now, let's see. Many questions here for you. There, will new jobs emerge to validate LLM inputs? outputs. Sorry.
Well, we're already seeing job titles like prompt engineer and that sort of stuff. I think, the question is really going to be right now, can you demonstrate that you really can add value? The problem with ChatGPT and its colleagues is it is so easy to use that an employer is likely to say, we don't need any expert on this. You just press a button and away it goes. And I think we have to be able to demonstrate to users that you could really make mistakes with this. You could lose opportunities and make bad decisions. There is something to know about how to use it. And I think we have made it so easy, and we've told everybody it's so simple, that employers who frankly don't want to spend any money on employees anyway, if they can avoid it, to tell them you really need an expert to do this for you, they're saying, no, I don't. I think the problem is, can we demonstrate quickly what an expert really could do for you?
Right.
So far, we haven't done that. We've downplayed that.
Right. Yeah, I think this was also in the context of, I think, literally validate in terms of, are we going to wind up with a fleet of young research assistants in every department charged with actually fact checking all of our outputs, and how will that, at which point I think we have to, do a little back of the envelope calculations on productivity and cost. What? Let's see. There was just running through our questions here, if you give me a moment. So here's a company. They say we have a comprehensive AI plus we've developed over recent months. And let's see, are there any, I guess, what would you consider to be top priorities for a policy around use of generative AI, and particularly LLMs in the workplace?
Yeah, these use policies are the first thing to do, and they're not that hard right now. I mean, I think the obvious one is you got to disclose whether you've used it and how you've used it, and that you have checked it. There's an interesting study that's come out recently, that sort of an experiment that gave people the opportunity to use ChatGPT, I think, in some management tasks and prepare a report. And the choice was, you could use it to build your own report, you could use it and then edit it, or you could just send it in. And people just sent it in, which is not a big surprise, right? In that context, though, that's something to worry about. If you've got this new tool that will save me a lot of time, and all I have to do is press a button and send it in, am I going to take the time to check it and to validate it myself? No. So unless we make it a really serious rule, right, and we have to start enforcing it. And that also means calling people out when there are mistakes made. And, we have to do that. We haven't done it. And on campuses, we haven't done it either. If you tell people not to use these tools on a paper and they do, we can, sometimes you suspect it, but we can't easily tell they have done it or not. So, you got a rule, you can't enforce it, you don't have a rule. So we got to figure out how to enforce those requirements and do that pretty fast.
Yeah. Yeah. And a related question was about sort of accountability. And I think this is in the corporate environment. Who is, especially when it's a tool that's sort of sanctioned and everybody, IT is paying for when having a little Copilot on their desktop, who is accountable for the error?
Well, that's great. I mean, I think we have to make the person who signs the document accountable for it, right? So if you use it and you accept it and you didn't check it for mistakes, you're accountable. I think this is why I think I'm increasingly inclined to think we ought to have a centralized office to do anything important. So maybe that means any document that is going to use LLM output that's going to a manager at a certain level, or going to get there at a certain level, has to be done by a central office. It's not that hard. I mean, if you got a central office, these folks know how to do it. They know how to structure them. It doesn't take them very long to do it. And then they send it back to you and you incorporate it or do what you want with it. But we're going to cut down on errors that way. And some of the, you don't need a big error to get an awful lot of attention. And especially if you're a big prominent company, the error rate may be really pretty small, but, tell that to your local newspaper, right? It'll be all over.
Right. And then here's a quote with a minute 56 to go. I feel like this is the $64 question. And Peter, in the absence of term papers and research required for humans to learn, are we set to lose or diminish our critical thinking ability to make sound decisions as we start using LLMs more and more?
Well, I think so, until we figure out a substitute, because I think right now, we know how much you learn from having to write something yourself. What you think you believe ends up being quite different if you have to write it up, right? You often change your view. That's why when you write books, the last thing you write is the introduction, because you think you know what the book is going to be about, but you don't until you're done. And along the way, you are learning to make these critical judgments and things. I don't know how we're going to substitute for that, which doesn't mean that we can't, but it does mean we better get busy thinking about it. And so far, we're not.
Very good. And that's, I think we're just about out of time. That's a good note to end on, I think. So thank you very much for being with us here. Thank you so much.
We're heading into our final session of the day. Our final speaker is Zeynep Tan, professor of the practice at the MIT Sloan School of Management. She's co-founder of the Good Jobs Institute and author of The Case for Good Jobs: How Great Companies Bring Dignity, Pay, and Meaning to Everyone's Work. Her work has repeatedly proven that good jobs are also good business. Welcome, Zeynep.
Thank you so much, Abby. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for listening as the last session. And I am going to talk about good jobs in the context of frontline work. So frontline work mostly in service industries, though the results, the work that I'm going to share with you applies to other contexts as well. But I'll be mostly talking about work in places like retail stores, restaurants, call centers, healthcare, hotels, etc. And many of these jobs we called, essential during the pandemic. So the work that these employees do is really important for us as a society. Our world literally stops without them. And as Peter was talking about AI and how it's unlikely to remove jobs, but when it comes to frontline work in this context, many of the jobs are hard to be automated, either by AI or even by robots. So these jobs are here to stay for our society. And in some ways, making the case for good jobs in this context is relatively easy, right? If the starting point of an organization is, and I hope a lot of organizations have this starting point, which is competitive advantage comes from continuously improving value for customers, right? This is how, there are different ways to grow profits and sales, but the good growth is when companies constantly improve value for their customers, and that's where the growth comes from. And if that's the starting point, if there's the focus on creating value for the customer, then of course what frontline employees do really matters. The fact that they, the idea that they need to do their work productively, accurately, efficiently is super important for creating customer value. And for any team to win with customers and to do the work well, they need to be a strong team that's set up for success, right? This is like, what kind of a winning team have we ever seen that doesn't have, that is not set up for success and that doesn't have great players? So this making the case for good jobs in some ways is quite simple if the starting point is the customer value. But what I have seen over and over during the last 25 years that I have been working in frontline settings is that the mental models oftentimes get in the way of creating a strong team that's set up for success. Many leaders believe that they can't afford to have that team when it comes to frontline settings. And the mental models that create that is one, everybody talks about how, people are our most important assets, but people don't show up as assets in the balance sheet. They show up as costs in the income statement. And oftentimes labor is seen just as another cost to be minimized. We are taught that market pay is the right pay, even if that pay might be unlivable pay, and even if people are not like other commodities, they're not like soybeans. Right, the amount of pay affects their health. It affects so many other things. But market pay is the right pay is the dominant mental model. And of course, there are a lot of people who can do the frontline jobs, right, in retail stores, in restaurants, in healthcare, etc. And when the supply of labor is that high, the market pay ends up being unlivable pay in so many of these settings. And another mental model is that, lean and mean is efficient. I'm an operations professor. I've been teaching operations for 20 years. And for people like us, lean and mean equals efficient makes no sense, because we know that lean and mean is actually not efficient. But these are the mental models that drive a lot of decisions. And that mental model, I have found, creates a vicious cycle in so many organizations. Because with that mental model, the tendency is to invest little in people, which means there's a lot of employee turnover. There's consistent understaffing. People have low ability, not because they have low ability, but because the pay is low, because there's not enough time for hiring the right people or training them well. And that low investment in people that leads to high turnover, low ability, and understaffing then leads to operational problems. Long lines at retail stores, or on shelves that are empty. Cold food in restaurants, or mistakes in hotels and in healthcare environments, and that reduces sales and profits. And when sales are lower, then companies' labor budgets shrink, and this vicious cycle continues. Now, this vicious cycle is already expensive for organizations. If you think about it, turnover costs alone can be significant. The nonprofit Good Jobs Institute that Abby mentioned, we have now worked with more than 30 companies that have frontline employees, and we have seen employee turnover levels anywhere from 30% to 200, 300% in one particular setting in Mexico. But the cost of, the direct cost of turnover, hiring, onboarding, training, and time to full productivity can range anywhere from 10 to 25% of payroll dollars spent every year. So the cost of turnover alone can be significant. And the other thing that is quite high, even higher than cost of turnover, tends to be all the lost sales that come from poor service, or long lines in retail stores, or empty shelves, and the cost of mistakes that happen that end up increasing product costs, and low labor productivity that comes from low people investment. And most importantly, so if you think about those costs, right, companies are not spending the money on labor, but they are spending the money. They are spending the money on lost sales, lower productivity, higher costs in terms of turnover and other costs. And even more importantly, when companies operate in this vicious cycle, they end up making a lot of interrelated decisions that create a weak system. And those interrelated decisions are, if turnover is high and there are a lot of mistakes that happen in the front lines, then frontline managers are firefighters, right? They're not leaders, they're not developing people, they're not improving performance, but they're firefighters. They're thinking about who didn't show up for work today, who are we going to fill in for that role, or they do the frontline work themselves because there aren't enough people. So they have no time to hire the right people and to train them properly, even if the company has amazing, hiring standards or amazing training standards or manuals on paper. And when companies don't hire the right people or they don't train them well, of course, there's little trust in ability and even in goodwill. So a lot of decisions tend to be, centralized, and front lines are asked to do rather than to think and to make decisions, which of course makes the job a worse job, and there are then even more mistakes and more problems. So part of this vicious cycle is the weak system that it creates, and that weak system means that now we can't have a strong team, and that team is not set up for success, because that team doesn't, we haven't invested in that team in terms of, paying them well, creating good schedules, investing really in their development, but also their work is unproductive and their work is unmotivating, right? When people are not allowed to make decisions, the jobs becomes a worse job. So this is the vicious cycle creates this weak system. And of course, if there is a problem in the system, then any one or two things is not going to improve it, right? A system problem requires a system solution. And the one good news that I will share with you is that during the last 7-8 years, the Good Jobs Institute, we have worked with more than 30 companies, and we have seen companies get out of this vicious cycle and improve their labor turnover, employee turnover, improve their productivity, and improve the value that they offer their customers. I'm going to give you a couple examples, like a couple companies, just to give you a set of the types of contexts where we have seen companies turn around and escape this vicious cycle. And I'll go do a deep dive into one company to show you what it looks like and what it takes to be able to get out of this cycle. So we have seen, I have 4 companies here, but just to give you a context, these companies represent retail, Quest Diagnostics, call centers, Urbanex is a pest control company, and Moe's Original Barbecue is a restaurant with just 2 units. So what you're seeing here is a public company like Quest Diagnostics, private companies, the other 3 are private. And you're also seeing a wide range of companies. Quest is a large company. Mudbay has about 60 stores right now. It's a pet retailer. And Moe's Original Barbecue is just a small chain. It's 2 units of a restaurant chain. But in all 4 contexts, you see the outcomes that improved after they escaped this vicious cycle. Their turnover improved, their productivity improved, and their customer satisfaction, loyalty, and as a result, sales improved. And one of the things that I have seen over and over is being able to get out of this vicious cycle requires a different way of thinking. It requires a lot of imagination of a better system that has both investment in people and good work, so that people are more productive, they can add more value, and the work is more motivating. Imagine a different system working in their environment and have the courage to adopt that system. And I'll come back to this courage and imagination as 2 words, because I've been teaching at business schools for 20 years, and we love numbers, we love data analysis, and oftentimes we put a lot more emphasis on doing rigorous, all else equal, isolated analyses using data versus helping people think in systems and imagine different possibilities and have courage to adopt it. So let me give you an example to see what this looks like. In 2017, so the example that I'm going to give you is from Sam's Club. So Sam's Club is a retail chain, and their biggest competitor is Costco. I imagine many people in this room will be familiar with Costco. And in 2017, John Furner became the CEO of Sam's Club. And John was Sam's Club's 14th CEO in 34 years. So if you do the math, you'll realize that the CEOs in this company oftentimes last somewhere around 2-3 years. So he was under tremendous performance pressure to improve the company. And when he became the CEO, the company was in trouble. They were way behind Costco in terms of their same-store sales growth, in terms of their productivity, in terms of turnover, and their numbers in metrics that are related to customers, frontline execution, or strong team set up for success did not look good at all, right? Their prices, this is a membership-based retailer, so members pay a price to be able to shop at their stores, which means that they need to provide their members the lowest prices, but their prices were too high. Their NPS, Net Promoter Score, was too low. On the frontline execution part, employees had trouble executing. Their labor productivity was way lower than Costco's. Employees oftentimes couldn't find the products in the stores. They wasted a lot of time trying to figure out the products, and their inventory data was quite inaccurate, which both were problematic because this company wanted to win by offering their customers a frictionless omni-channel experience. So if those of you who are in the retail space would know that if the objective is to provide that frictionless omni experience for customers, then you better have very accurate inventory data, and you better be able to find the products that are in your store. Otherwise, there will be a lot of unsatisfied and frustrated customers. So they were really lagging in frontline execution, and not surprisingly, their turnover was too high. It took a long time to be able to fill manager positions. There were oftentimes, managers who left, and frontline employee turnover and manager turnover oftentimes go hand in hand. So they had high manager turnover, high frontline turnover, and it took a long time to fill those manager positions. And another part of the weak system, which is very it's very consistent with what I have seen in so many other organizations, is companies that operate in a vicious cycle, because they cannot win with their customers through creating great service for them. What they end up doing over time is to be able to grow, especially the top line growth, sales growth, they end up adding more and more to their customer offering. So they add more products, they add more services, they open longer hours. And before you know it, there's a lot of complexity in the front lines, right? The work itself is so complicated because of all these new products, new services, new promotions, etc. And that makes things worse. That doesn't set up people for success. So this is the status quo that John Furner finds himself in, right? Weak team that's not set up for success, poor execution, and customers who don't get great value. And he realizes that to be able to turn this around, he can't do just one or two changes. He needs to look at the system and see why do we have these turnover problems? Why is there so much complexity? How can we reduce complexity and address those? So he looked at the system and came up with a lot of ideas. He and his team came up with a lot of ideas to improve the system. And one of those ideas was to increase pay. So they decided, they wanted early on to increase the pay of a specific group of employees. So these were employees who cut meat. These were employees who worked in the fresh products department. And these were employees who worked in the bakery and led teams. And they decided that they would raise pay $5 to $7 an hour from a basis of around $15 an hour for these key positions. Just imagine the impact of that pay increase in people's lives. But when they wanted to raise pay this much, HR came and HR said, don't do it. The last time we raised pay, it didn't reduce turnover. Finance came and finance said, don't do it. It's not in the budget. And this is exactly what we see in so many other organizations. Oftentimes, they will see the system problem. They will see what needs to change to be able to change the system. But when it comes to individual changes, then everybody goes to analyzing that individual change in isolation from the other parts of the system, and oftentimes using historical data and come up with conclusions, right? So this and this could be about increasing pay. It could be about reducing complexity. It could be about, if the problem is understaffing, adding more hours, right? Any specific change, all else equal data-centric thinking encourages people to ignore the other parts of the system. And John realized, though, that this is not how they were going to do. So his question was, instead of saying, what is the financial case for increasing pay? What is the return on that investment? He asked a very different question. He said, can we be a great company if we don't raise pay? Right? And he asked this question because he was seeing the connections and imagining possibilities. So in his mind and in the mind of his a few others in the leadership team, they want to improve the value for the customer. They couldn't do that if the front lines didn't execute well. Well, they couldn't execute well if they didn't reduce employee turnover, because turnover was causing a lot of problems in the frontline execution. And they realized that they can't reduce turnover if they don't raise pay, because people were leaving for jobs that paid a couple more dollars an hour more. So they realized, yeah, pay alone may not reduce turnover, but we can't reduce it if we don't raise pay. So they decided, yes, we're going to raise pay, and we're going to make all the other changes to make pay off. All the other changes and those other changes were, along with investment in people, they made other key interdependent decisions to improve the work of the front lines, reduce their workloads, and to be able to make the pay investment worthy. So a couple of the changes I'll mention quickly. They reduce complexity tremendously by reducing the number of products that they offer their customers. It turns out that more is not always better, right? It turns out that if companies can offer customers fewer but better products and better service along with that and better prices, then customers will be very happy about that. They did a huge investment in IT to be able to improve the member experience and simplify the job. So they made a bunch of different changes, and within 2 years, these changes together got them out of that vicious cycle and got them into a virtuous cycle. So their net promoter score increased 7%. They were able to reduce their prices. Their labor productivity increased 16%. And previously, it was so difficult to raise labor productivity even by a couple percentage points. Their employee turnover in the front lines for hourly workers was down 25%. It was down even more for frontline managers. Their percentage of full-timers went up, and now it became much easier to be able to fill the manager roles and promote employees, because they started building a talent pipeline. And of course, when you can create more value for the customer, and when you have this strong team that's set up for success and you have high productivity, that shows up in profitability and growth numbers as well. So this company that used to be a struggling arm of Walmart is now a growth engine for the parent company Walmart. And John Furner, who was the CEO of Sam's Club, after a little bit more than 2 years, became the CEO of Walmart USA, which also is on a good jobs journey as well. So this example, along with others, I hope, and my colleagues at Good Jobs Institute, who are mostly my former employees, we hope that their success will make it much easier for other leaders to be able to bet on their people and to make their jobs and their lives and performance better. And I will say, as the last thing, and I know I'm out of time, but as we work with different leaders in different organizations, we saw how much this system change, improving jobs, improving performance, how much of a difference it made for the leaders themselves. When at Sam's Club, when they announced the first pay raises, the $5 to $7 pay raises, some employees cried, right? A couple of more dollars an hour for a lot of workers is the difference between working one job or two jobs. It's the difference between getting enough sleep or not. Sam's Club also offered stable schedules. And again, having a stable schedule is, it's the difference between having a chaotic life versus a sane life. It's the difference between, not spending time with your children and spending time with your children. So for the leaders who made this change, not only were they now winning with their customers and having this stronger company, but they were able to change the lives of workers, and that was quite meaningful. So I'll stop here and see if you have any questions.
Zainab, that was so interesting. That it's such a great positive story, but also such a well-supported story. So thank you so much for your examples and your research and the work that you're doing with companies to help them do better at great jobs. So we do have questions coming in from the audience. The first one is, The vicious cycle you shared seems difficult to beat as long as stock markets reward companies for short-term gains in sacrifice of long-term value. As CEOs get measured with the same lenses, what expectation is there that the system will actually change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my best answer to that, Abby, is the change from Walmart to Sam's Club, right? This is a public company. In fact, in 2015, when Walmart, even before Sam's Club, when they made their first investment in people decision, and they told the Wall Street how much it will cost them, their stock price dropped like 10% or something the next day, right? Immediate impact. It got back to, it didn't last a long time. So it's true. Like, investors do not value people investments as much as they value some other investments, like in technology. But I think as long as company leaders can tell a compelling story about why they're doing this, right? Look, if we don't do this, we may not be able to survive. Look at Borders, look at Toys R Us, look at all these other companies. They did not improve the value for their customers, and they're no longer with us, right? For us to improve value for our customers, we have to have a strong team that's set up for success. It's not a very difficult story to tell. And there are other companies who have been thriving like that for decades now, which also bring more legitimacy to investors as well. Costco is a great example, right? Costco is, the average pay in retail in 2023 was $17 an hour. The average pay at Costco was $26 an hour. And Costco offers the lowest prices. And if you look at their stock performance versus the S&P 500, like, they are outliers. They're so much better. So telling the story and why doing this is I think quite important.
So you said that market pay, it was the wrong mental model to say that market pay is the right pay. So what is the right mental model for right pay?
Yeah, that's a great question. In settings where frontline employees are not making enough to live, one of the good things to look at is what percentage of our full-time employees are making a living wage, right? There are a bunch of different living wage calculators out there. One of them that, of course, we use a lot at Good Jobs Institute is MIT's living wage calculator. And a good benchmark is to look at least the living wage, because if people are not making ends meet, nothing else matters. Like, pay alone doesn't guarantee a good job. Pay alone is not, doesn't guarantee high productivity or high performance. But absence of sufficient pay, and by sufficient, I mean a living wage, guarantees high turnover. And it guarantees that employees won't be able to focus on the job, because many of them will have multiple jobs, and low pay is associated with a bunch of stuff, including lower cognitive functioning.
Yeah, I mean, it's also system based for the employees, not just for the company, right? Health,
yes,
living, and all of those things. So I think this question maybe isn't thinking so much about frontline workers, but we'll ask it anyway. A certain amount of turnover is always necessary and healthy. Does your research share any insights on what a healthy or positive amount of turnover is?
Yeah, I mean, of course, some turnover can be healthy. And it also depends on, the company's hiring practices, training practices, internal development, right? Costco's employee turnover is 8%. The turnover in the retail average is 60%. So I can easily say 60% is unhealthy turnover, and 8% turnover is probably healthy turnover, right? Because not even if you have the best training and the best hiring, sometimes you make mistakes, right? And sometimes the environment is not a good fit for the worker or for the environment. It's hard to say a number, but I think leaders and frontline managers immediately know when turnover is a problem and when it's not a problem, right? It is a problem when there's so much instability that there's no people development, where you can't hire the right people, you can't train them well, when there are so many mistakes, when people are showing up late or not showing up at all. So it's easy to know when turnover is a problem, but hard to put a number on it for every context.
One of the things that I love about your work is, so Costco, has for years been a pretty good employer and had good results. And so working with Sam's Club, there's this contrast that was there from the beginning. And I especially love the fact that now it's in Walmart, which is, I don't know, was Walmart still the largest employer in the world? I mean, for a long time they were. They have so many employees. So to have that kind of a big impact is fantastic. But my question is, are there other industries that you're working in where you have that kind of a contrast, where one company's already doing good things and the company that is trying to get better can, there's that sort of competitive aspect as well?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of industries there are contrasts. In some ways, Abby, Sam's Club could have looked at Costco and said, you know what, we have very different customers. We're not in high income locations. Our customers are not as wealthy as Costco's customers, so they could find excuses for why this model would not apply to them. In pest control, we work with a pest control company. And we haven't found, maybe there are contrasts, but we haven't given them that contrast in the look at that pest control company. But I think the good exemplars, Costco, Four Seasons, different companies could be a role model, even if you're not in that industry, to say, look at the difference. Look at the difference. And we can be different in our industry as well.
So we have time for one more quick question. And that is, because it's so system-based, to really get to those results, you can't just look at pay, you can't just look at product mix, have to look at it all together. How big of a challenge is that for organizations and their executive teams to do that work together?
Yeah, all the companies we work with, our biggest challenge and the biggest win tends to be bringing those cross-sectional organization leaders together, because they have for years learned how to look at things in silos, and I'm going to reduce complexity, and all I'm going to look at is complexity, or I'm going to look at pay, or I'm going to look at schedules. Bringing them together is not an easy task, but it's not, when there's a will, this is not brain surgery, right? If the leaders want to do this, it can be done. It has been done, and yes, it's not easy, but it's not all that difficult either if there's a will. Humans do amazing things.
And that is a great note to end on, Zeynep. Thank you so much for being with us, and continue the great work that you're doing. Really happy to be associated with you through Sloan and to watch the work that you continue to do. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Such a great day today. So many good talks, Elizabeth.
Absolutely. And I do think that, Zeynep's work on good jobs is, for me, such an inspiring note on which to end this event, because, she shows you can do it, especially this research from, from Costco and Sam's Club. As the research shows, when we put the human factor first, you can get positive business results. But I think to get there, you have to start with the kind of truth-telling that Jim Dietrich talked about this morning. I think we do need a willingness to confront and talk about why burnout and impossible jobs continue in our culture, and confront the contradictions that make this happen, and talk about why recruitment and hiring processes have remained sloppy and informal when we know that increased rigor that mitigates bias actually improves employment outcomes and also elevates candidates from many marginalized groups. So, there's so much here that it feels, in some ways, it feels like low-hanging fruit for organizations if we can get to it.
But change is really hard. And so I think today, throughout the day, we've been challenged to confront new realities and old mindsets, and to take concrete steps for positive change. We hope you've enjoyed the experience with us, that you've gotten at least a few solid ideas to take back and apply within your own organization. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you to our event sponsors, Wharton Executive Education, Stanford Business Books, and MIT Sloan Executive Education. We appreciate your support.